The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 8089 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a revised business programme for today, Tuesday the 29th of October, and tomorrow, Wednesday the 30th of October. I'd ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 8089.
Move, Presiding Officer.
No member is asked to speak against the motion, therefore I will now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 8089 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is a statement by John Swinney on an update on Grangemouth. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, and there should therefore be no interventions or interruptions. I call on John Swinney. Cabinet Secretary, you've got 10 minutes.
Presiding Officer, the Grangemouth refinery and petrochemical plant comprise the largest industrial site in Scotland. The combined site employs 1,350 people and directly contributes around £500 million of gross value added, around 0.5% to the Scottish economy. When the wider contribution of the plant is considered, such as the additional activities supported through the supply chain and the induced effects on the economy, it is estimated that the complex supports around £1 billion of GVA, 1% of the Scottish total, and around 6,500 jobs. The complex is also a critical component of the distribution and refinery capacity associated with production from the North Sea. It is central to the operation of the Forties pipeline system, which transports crude oil and gas liquids from offshore and onshore entry points with a nominal capacity in excess of 1 million barrels per day and carries around 40% of the United Kingdom's oil production. The site is of strategic significance to the Scottish economy, and for that reason, securing the future of the site has been a major priority for this government for some time. The First Minister, Fergus Ewing, and I have been engaged extensively on this issue throughout the recess period, working with a range of stakeholders. Our sole aim has been to broker an agreement which would ensure a secure economic future for the plant, while simultaneously exploring all possible contingencies should this outcome have failed to materialise. Ministers have consistently engaged with the company who own the site, INEOS, on many occasions in recent years, when considering a variety of issues ranging across, amongst other subjects, ensuring continuity of fuel supply during previous industrial action and in discussions over future investment proposals. Ministers were advised on the 13th of September that Unite the Union intended to ballot for industrial action up to and including strike action in connection with two issues: the alleged victimisation by INEOS of a Unite official, Stephen Deans, and the use by INEOS of agency staff. On the 27th of September, Unite members voted to support industrial action on both counts, and the Union decided to implement an overtime ban and a work-to rule to support their concerns. The First Minister and I were engaged directly on this issue, encouraging both sides to enter into meaningful dialogue to try to resolve these issues, recognising the significant impact that would arise if there was to be even the shortest period of industrial action. The Government took this approach directly by contacting INEOS and Unite personnel. We were proactively seeking a solution and maintained active and regular discussion at ministerial and official level with the United Kingdom Government, and I spoke on several occasions to the Secretary of State for Energy to coordinate our initiatives and our responses. Our efforts were underpinned by the Scottish Government Emergency Cabinet Subcommittee, which met to help focus the resources of the whole of Government on managing this issue. As we took forward this approach, INEOS set out the details of a survival plan that it believed had to be implemented to secure the future of the site. This plan involved changes to the terms and conditions of employees, replacement of the pension scheme, reforms to collective bargaining arrangements and other provisions. On Friday the 11th of October, after talks within the plant did not make progress, Unite announced that it intended to take strike action for a 48-hour period commencing at 0700 hours on the 20th of October. During that weekend, Scottish and UK Government ministers engaged with INEOS and Unite to encourage both sides to enter into substantive dialogue to resolve the issues, ideally through the Conciliation Service ACAS. The First Minister, along with the Secretary of State Ed Davey, intervened directly to press the urgency of this move. On Monday and Tuesday, the 14th and 15th of October, these talks took place under the auspices of ACAS. Considerable progress was made, and at one stage an agreement was judged to be possible, but the talks collapsed in the early hours of Wednesday, the 16th of October. The consequence of this failure was that INEOS continued to take the plant out of operation on the grounds that although Unite had unilaterally cancelled the industrial action, further action could commence at any time. The following day, the First Minister and I met with both Unite and INEOS to try to construct an agreement. We proposed that a two-part deal be taken forward in which Unite would withdraw its threat of strike action until the end of the year and INEOS would restart the plant that had been stood down. We also judged that this represented a realistic way of making progress, enabling the plants to start production and for substantive discussions to be held on the issues at stake. Much to our regret, after initial indications that this would be approved, this approach failed to hold at a meeting between the shop stewards and the company on the 18th of October. As a consequence, the wind-down of the plant continued and the company continued to consult the workforce directly on the contents of the survival plan. Unite asked its members to reject the survival plan. On Monday, the 21st of October, it became clear that about half of the workforce had accepted the plan and half had rejected it. After a day of consideration, INEOS announced the closure of the petrochemical plant on the 23rd of October. Throughout this intervening period, ministers and officials were in frequent dialogue with both Unite and INEOS to try to avert industrial action, but also to advance the necessary contingency arrangements to ensure continuity of fuel supply in Scotland. We acted because if the petrochemical plant at Grangemouth were to permanently close, we estimated that there would have been a direct loss of around 800 jobs and £290 million of gross value added from the economy. Closure would also have led to a legacy of environmental impacts which would have required remediation. We engaged the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency in our work to ensure that should such a situation have arisen, we had an early understanding of the cost that former owners would have to bear, but of equal importance, to support informed decision about alternative activities on this important site. In the immediate aftermath of the INEOS announcement on the 23rd of October, the Scottish Government continued active discussions with both parties, and the First Minister spoke with the Unite Secretary in Scotland, Pat Rafferty, and then with the Chairman of INEOS Capital, Jim Ratcliffe, to advise him that the Unite position was likely to change. On Thursday, I continued these discussions with both parties at the Grangemouth plant, along with the Secretary of State for Scotland. It became clear that morning that Unite intended to accept the terms of the INEOS survival plan and to agree to commit to no industrial action during the period in which the investment plans were proceeding. That approach made it possible that the closure announcement could be reversed. The First Minister also met with Len McCluskey, the General Secretary of Unite, Pat Rafferty and with BP at the highest level to assist in resolving outstanding matters. Last Friday, INEOS announced that its earlier decision to close the petrochemical plant would be reversed and the investment proposal it had made would be implemented. This would provide a secure future for the plant and provide a positive outlook for the next 25 years. This decision, whilst involving significant changes to the terms and conditions of members of staff, was welcomed with relief given the stark and immediate impact that would have been felt from a closure announcement. Indeed, by the time I met local businesses drawn together by Falkirk Council last Thursday, along with the Secretary of State for Scotland, many of those businesses recounted negative short-term impacts as a consequence of the closure of the plant for just a few days. Guest houses no longer filled with contractors, tool hire firms with little or no work, maintenance companies with no active plant to maintain. In just a few short days, the significant impact of a plant closure was felt very directly in the locality. Over the last 2 weeks, the priority of the Scottish Government has been to bring INEOS and Unite together to resolve the dispute and to resume normal working. Our assessment of the situation did not give us total confidence that the issues at stake could be readily resolved. We therefore pursued other options, including to seek new ownership for the plant in the event of a closure announcement. We did so because we were not prepared to accept the closure of the petrochemical plant and believed it was our role to actively work to ensure a better outcome was achieved. We actively contacted a number of interested parties in partnership with Scottish Enterprise and took discussions to an advanced level. The Scottish Government has undertaken discussions with INEOS about supporting their investment plans for some time, and I have confirmed to INEOS that, providing the already agreed employment conditions continue to be satisfied, regional selective assistance to a level of £9 million will be applied to support their investment plans. This is part of a package that includes loan guarantees provided by the United Kingdom Government. This investment, along with the investment from INEOS Capital and a contribution from BP in connection with the adjustment to some commercial terms around the interaction with the Forties pipeline system and the security of utility supply, will secure the future of the plant. The Scottish Government considers the Grangemouth complex to be a strategic asset for our country and has believed without reservation that the plant had and has a strong and prosperous future. Investment in the plant was, of course, required, but that should not be used to assert any underlying weakness in the financial prospects of the plant. The last 2 weeks have been a period of acute anxiety for the workforce at Grangemouth. Indeed, for a period in excess of 24 hours, hundreds of employees and their families would have faced deep uncertainty about their economic future. Throughout this period, the Scottish Government has acted to protect the interests and the livelihoods of these individuals. There are many matters that are deeply unsatisfactory about the conduct of industrial relations in this instance between the company and the union at Grangemouth. We hope both the company and the union will now work together for the future of the plant. However, the overriding priority of the Scottish Government has been to secure the future of the plant, and that is what we have worked to do.
The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on issues raised in his statement and tend to allow a flexible 20 minutes for questions, after which we move on to the next business. It would be helpful if members who wish to ask a question were to press the request to speak button now. Anna Colley-Gray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I draw the Chamber's attention to the Register of Interest, my entry there, which shows that I am a member of Unite the Union. A thanks too to the Cabinet Secretary for early sight of his statement. To secure what we all hope is a bright future for the Grangemouth plant and refinery from a point where its closure and the loss of thousands of jobs looked inevitable was a great result. Scottish ministers, not least the Cabinet Secretary, and their UK Government colleagues deserve much credit then for working together, refusing to accept that closure and shepherding the negotiations to a positive outcome. Above all, though, we have to recognise the painful sacrifices which the workforce have made in reductions to terms and conditions to save not just their own jobs, but also many thousands of jobs in the supply chain and the value of the plant to the Scottish economy and to the local economy in the Falkirk area. There is an obligation now on the company to deliver the survival plan. Scottish and UK governments are providing, not for the first time, significant investment in this plant in the form of grants and loan guarantees. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what assurances they have been given by the company, and also what can be done as that investment unfolds to avoid the lack of transparency regarding the finances of this vital strategic operation, which rather dogged the negotiations around its future?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, can I thank Ian Gray for his generous remarks and also acknowledge, as I have done in my statement, the fact that members of staff at the Grangemouth petrochemicals plant and the refinery, for that matter, have accepted a diminution of their terms and conditions of employment, and that has not only protected employment within the site, but protected employment across the very extensive supply chain that is tied up with the activities of the Grangemouth plant. And that is, as I made clear in my statement, the decision to accept the survival plan was the material factor in changing the course of this particular set of events. In relation to Mr Gray's specific questions, as I think he will be familiar, regional selective assistance from the Scottish Government's part is only provided where there is particular eligibility in terms of employment guarantees and where those guarantees are fulfilled. So, for example, in relation to previous instances of regional selective assistance that have been given to the INEOS plant, those elements of grant support that we've given in the past remain in force, and if the commitments that were made around those elements of regional selective assistance in the past were not fulfilled, the government would be able to reclaim the grant money involved, and the same rules apply in relation to this circumstance. As for the UK Government loan guarantees, I can't furnish Mr Gray with a definitive answer to these points, but I do know from the active discussions that we had with the United Kingdom Government that a very extensive process of due diligence is underway as part of that exercise about loan guarantees with Her Majesty's Treasury, and the issues that we have looked at in relation to regional selective assistance will be very similar issues to which the United Kingdom Government will look in relation to the loan guarantees. On Mr Gray's final point about the transparency of the finances of the INEOS company, clearly INEOS has an obligation in terms of the legal framework to satisfactorily set out and to record all relevant financial information about the operations of the company. I do believe that would be enhanced by ever greater clarity around the financing of the plant. I made it clear in a number of media interviews over the recess period that I felt the description of the plant as distressed was an entirely inappropriate reference to be made to the plant. It certainly required investment, yes, but I think the plant had and has a strong future, and the Scottish Government will certainly work to ensure that it attracts the necessary investment to guarantee that future.
Murdo Fraser.
Thank you. Can I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's statement and thank him for the advance copy. As he fairly said, the closure of the Grangemouth plant would have been catastrophic for those whose jobs depended on it and deeply damaging to the wider Scottish economy. Can I commend the Cabinet Secretary and his colleagues in the Scottish Government for their prompt action in helping keeping the plant open, and also commend the Secretary of State for Scotland and his colleagues in the UK Government. The Scottish people are clearly well served by their two governments working closely together. Presiding Officer, we cannot forget that it was the irresponsible actions of Unite the Union which put this plant at risk. No one in the Scottish Labour Party has dared to criticise their union paymasters, but can the Cabinet Secretary tell us how the Scottish Government will foster a more responsible approach to industrial relations in the future? And secondly, the Grangemouth petrochemicals plant's future will depend on the importation of huge quantities of shale gas across the Atlantic from the US. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that its future would be more secure with a domestic source of shale gas? And can he say how the Scottish Government will encourage the development of a shale gas industry here in Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Mr Fraser for his, again for his generous remarks, and say that what I have strenuously tried to do, and the First Minister and Mr Ewing have strenuously tried to do over the last few weeks, is to frankly resist the temptation that Mr Fraser has embarked upon of trying to apportion any blame in this issue. We have tried to bring people together to resolve these issues, not try to play games with people's lives or their livelihoods. And what the Scottish Government has focused on is trying to resolve clearly difficult industrial relations issues at the Grangemouth plant. And I certainly hope that the way in which we have acted to try to bring the relevant parties together, to secure agreement where we can, to come very close to agreement, which I thought we had done a week past Thursday night, to at least kick-start a process of substantive discussion, will be the style and the approach that we take forward to try to resolve these issues. I'd also have to say to Mr Fraser that I can think of a number of other industrial situations around the country in which Unite the Union are involved, where good process, good dialogue, good cooperation between the trade union and management has resolved very significant economic difficulties facing plants. And I can think of a number of very real examples where cooperation and commitment between management and unions, including the Unite the Union, has helped to resolve some of these difficulties, and we welcome that approach. Finally, in relation to shale gas, Mr Fraser is correct that the strategy that INEOS have embarked upon is predicated on the importation of shale gas from the United States. That is a business proposition in which I think the company clearly has confidence, because it wouldn't be investing £300 million in the Grangemouth plant if it did not believe that that was a satisfactory and beneficial opportunity. In relation to the domestic debate on shale gas, the Scottish Government has made it absolutely clear that all propositions that come forward in relation to any shale gas exploration or development will be considered within the legislative and planning framework that ministers have set out over time, and that is our clearly expressed position on these questions.
Angus MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As the local member, can I first of all place on record my thanks and appreciation to the Cabinet Secretary, the First Minister and the Energy Minister for their major input in resolving the Grangemouth situation last week and averting what could have been an absolute disaster for the local economy. It's clear the engagement between the Scottish Government and INEOS and Unite was extensive. Can the Cabinet Secretary detail the number and extent of the contacts between the Scottish Government and all other parties?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, in my statement I've set out as fully as I can, although I can't give a specific number about the occasions of contact that we've had, but certainly over the last 2 weeks there has been very intense dialogue between ministers and INEOS and Unite. We've also had extensive discussions with BP. We've had discussions with the local authority, with the Forth Valley Chamber of Commerce, with Forth Valley College, and a variety of other interested parties in an attempt to resolve these issues. And of course, as I said in my statement, we have taken forward discussions with a range of other interested parties who were prepared to consider any change of ownership that may have arisen at the Grangemouth plant to work with our objective of ensuring continuity of employment for the individuals who are employed at the Grangemouth facility.
Neil Findlay, followed by Maureen Watt.
The situation at Grangemouth saw one wealthy, very powerful individual control one of the most important strategic industrial assets in this country. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that this episode has put the debate about the common ownership of such assets very firmly back on the political agenda, and that we cannot allow actions such as those of Ratcliffe to threaten our energy supply and distribution in the future?
Cabinet Secretary.
There certainly is a very active debate about common ownership of major strategic assets for the country, and of course the Grangemouth refinery and petrochemicals plant is one of those facilities. There's also a very active debate about the common ownership in the public interest of the Royal Mail, which is one that certainly the Government believes should be retained in common ownership. I look forward to Mr Finlay's firm support and that of his party for the position that the Scottish Government adopts in that respect. And of course these issues will be considered and debated. What I think we have to ensure is that at all times we are very explicit about where the strategic interest of Scotland lies and what the Scottish Government can do to act to protect that strategic interest. And I can assure Mr Finlay that whenever such circumstances arise where the Scottish Government can act to protect the strategic Scottish interest, we will do exactly that.
Maureen Watt, followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware that in 2008 there was also trouble at the Grangemouth plant, and 5 years on we're here again. What steps can the Scottish Government take to ensure that commitments are followed through this time, and that the Forties pipeline will be taking oil and gas from the North Sea for decades to come, and that the rest of the Grangemouth plant also has a strong future for decades and not just another few years? And does he believe that having worker representation on boards might help in this matter?
Cabinet Secretary.
I certainly would want to reassure Maureen Watt that I feel we're in a significantly different position to the situation in 2008. There was a period of industrial disruption in 2008 and issues were not resolved and concluded at that time. I think the issues at stake in relation to terms and conditions, and particularly the sustainability of the INEOS pension scheme, have been resolved as a consequence of this particular industrial dispute, although I recognise, as I did in my response to Ian Gray, the fact that that will have been a difficult issue to wrestle with for members of staff involved in the plant. In terms of commitments going forward, INEOS have been absolutely clear that on the basis of the acceptance by the workforce of the survival plan and the commitments that have been made by the Scottish Government, the United Kingdom Government and by BP, that there is a very strong and very vibrant future for the plant for at least the next 25 years. And that clearly involves the opportunities for the Forties pipeline into the bargain. So we will certainly be actively involved in discussion with the company to ensure that that transpires and that that is the future that lies ahead for the INEOS plant. In relation to Maureen Watt's question about worker representation on the board, I do think that companies' attitudes and perspectives are enhanced by a breadth of participation in the boards, and particularly by employee representation. And that, of course, is an important issue to consider as we try to build the best possible climate for industrial relations within our economy in Scotland.
Will Rennie, followed by Annabel Ewing.
Can I thank the Finance Secretary for an advance copy of his statement? He documented the effective and welcome kind of partnership working between the Secretary of State, Ed Davey, and Alistair Carmichael. And people would have found it reassuring that both governments were working together in this time of crisis. It was also reassuring to know that talks were underway with potential new buyers. This morning, Joan McAlpine detailed the discussions that the First Minister had had with Andrew Ovens from Greenergy in Uphall in a way that these, and she also talked about the way that these talks were reported to INEOS. Can the Finance Secretary give the Scottish Government's official account of these talks?
I think that's a matter for another statement, but Cabinet Secretary, if you want to address some of the points.
Well, I'm very happy to say to Willie Rennie that, well, first of all, Mr Rennie shouldn't be surprised that the Scottish and United Kingdom governments are able to work together. We work together on a whole host of different questions. The debate would be enhanced if people like Mr Rennie didn't go around peddling the fact that we can't work together most of the time, but we work frequently cooperatively together to resolve issues, and people shouldn't be at all surprised that we're able to do that on this particular issue. In relation to the question of alternative ownership, can I say to Mr Rennie that the Government was involved in discussions with a number of parties. I'm not going to go through all of the details about all of the discussions that we had with a number of parties, but we did that because we were not confident that the strategy that was being pursued to try to bring INEOS and Unite together was going to work. So we had an alternative approach which involved a number of discussions with a number of interested parties. They did not require to be utilised because of the changed circumstances last Friday, but I can assure him that the Government gave every effort to ensure that that was the case as part of our strategy to protect employment at Grangemouth.
Annabel Ewing, followed by Mark Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I would commend the work of the Cabinet Secretary and indeed the First Minister and the Energy Minister in helping to facilitate such a result. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if he believes that the experience of Grangemouth can have some bearing on future industrial relations in Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think it can, and in a fashion that I think there's a lot of lessons that have to be learnt from the example that we've just gone through at Grangemouth, where, and the contrast is with the examples that I cited in response to Mr Fraser. I've been involved in a whole number of different scenarios that attract none of the media coverage that Grangemouth has attracted over the last fortnight, none of the scrutiny, because the management and the workforce are sitting round the same table, looking at the same information, wrestling with the same problems and worried about the same questions, and actually trying to resolve them between themselves. And I have to say I much prefer those particular examples because they ensure that all of the talent of a company is able to be deployed to resolve the challenges facing any organisation. And if there's one lesson that can be learnt from the Grangemouth issue over the last fortnight, it is that lesson that closer working between management and trade unions is an essential bedrock of successful industrial and economic relations in our country.
I now have 6 members who wish to ask a question of the Cabinet Secretary. I am prepared to let the time run on to allow all 6 to be taken, but I'd appreciate cooperation by members in keeping their questions short. Mark Griffin, followed by Kevin Stewart.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary will know from his meeting with Falkirk Council that they have set up a task force as a precaution to support any local job losses. What support can the Scottish Government give to this Falkirk Council task force?
Cabinet Secretary.
At the meeting that I held with Falkirk Council and businesses on Thursday, I made clear that the Scottish Government's support to the local business community would principally manifest itself through the work of the Business Gateway, which is available to provide assistance to companies that are in any difficulty. The Chamber of Commerce, the Forth Valley Chamber of Commerce, also made it clear that they would make available resources and advice to any companies who were feeling the effects of the rundown of the Grangemouth facility, which, as I recounted in my statement, has had material consequences for a number of companies. And the Scottish Government will be very happy, as I made clear to the Leader of the Council, to provide any input that the Council would require to the task force, consistent with our desire to ensure that we create the best possible conditions for employment growth in the Falkirk area.
Kevin Stewart, followed by Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Will the Cabinet Secretary look at what further support could be available to diversify employment at Grangemouth to ensure that Grangemouth benefits from low-carbon technology?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm certainly happy to do that. I think there is there's a clear recognition that the Grangemouth site is heavily dependent on petrochemical and refining activity. There are complementary activities that could be developed on such an extensive site, and indeed as part of the survival plan that INEOS are taking forward, there will be a number of changes that will be made to plant configuration and operation on the site. So there will be opportunities to pursue the type of agenda that Mr Stewart has talked about, and the Government will certainly engage constructively to try to bring that about.
Margaret Mitchell, followed by Dennis Robertson.
For the Advanced South East statement. Having met with Falkirk Council last Friday to discuss the ongoing situation at Grangemouth, I confirmed that there was a palpable sense of release amongst all parties and in the town generally that agreement had been reached. In view of this, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if he has any indication of the economic benefit, for example, from the new terminal in terms of construction jobs, and whether there will be any impact with the building of this new site on existing hazard zones around the plant?
Secretary.
There will be a process of active management of the site that will have to be undertaken by INEOS to deal with any implications or crossover from the construction activity into existing parts of the site. Obviously, the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency have been active on our behalf in ensuring that any issues around site management in relation to environmental implications are properly and fully considered and assessed, and that responsibility will be taken forward on an ongoing basis by SEPA, who act on our behalf in this respect. In relation to the economic impact of the wider construction activity, I don't have any detail that I can give Margaret Mitchell today, but it's safe to say that one of the points I made to the business gathering when they asked me what the Scottish Government could do to assist in strengthening the local economy, my response was that the best thing we could do was work to resolve the dispute at Grangemouth, to ensure that there was a £300 million investment coming into the Grangemouth area from private investment. And we need to leverage in private investment into the economy to support development opportunities. And I'm glad that we have created the foundations upon which that can be undertaken.
Dennis Robertson, followed by Drew Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary mentioned in his statement the environmental issues, and he partially answered the question with Margaret Mitchell. The environmental situation was quite considerable within the site, but can the Cabinet Secretary perhaps say what role SEPA played over the past 2 weeks, looking at the full implications of any impact on the environment with a potential closure?
Cabinet Secretary.
SEPA have an ongoing responsibility to ensure that sites are properly managed and that any commitments that are required under the licences that are made available by SEPA for particular operations are properly and entirely fulfilled by companies. SEPA have undertaken that activity and that role, as they always do, but ministers have also considered with SEPA what additional steps required to be taken to ensure that, should the petrochemicals plant have closed, what ongoing and further implications there would have been that would have had to have been managed as a consequence of that. And SEPA have assisted us greatly in providing advice in that respect.
Drew Smith and finally Patrick Harvey.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Mr Swinney-Gray mentioned the sacrifice of the workforce to secure the continued operation of the plant, not just to secure the existing jobs there, but also the hope of jobs for others into the future. And when he referred to the 9 million in regional selective assistance, he said that that would be paid provided that already agreed employment conditions continue to be satisfied. Could he say a bit more about what that statement encompasses, and could he indicate whether or not the conditions attached to regional selective assistance differ significantly in this case from other examples of RSA which might have been provided in the past?
Cabinet Secretary.
Let me just clarify part of what Mr Smith set out there, because if I didn't express it clearly enough earlier on, then I'll put it on the record once again. The point I was making to Mr Gray is that previous examples of regional selective assistance have certain conditions attached to them, and they must continue to be fulfilled, or the government claws back that regional selective assistance. The decision-making we have gone through in relation to this further round of regional selective assistance is essentially dealing with conditions in connection with this particular grant award. Those conditions are consistent with the assessment that is taken out in other comparable situations to ensure that the criteria around levels of employment are assured, and of course they have to be assured for a period of 3 years beyond the last payment that is made in any regional selective assistance award.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. Following his positive comments on the role of workforce representation on boards, can the Cabinet Secretary tell us what specific actions the Government can take to further that agenda, such as conditionality on the RSA and other grant schemes, so that we never again see a billionaire happily pocketing taxpayers' cash before laughing all the way to the comfort of his super yacht after playing such reckless games of brinkmanship with people's livelihood?
Cabinet Secretary.
Throughout this whole issue in the last fortnight, I've been incredibly careful about the language that I've used in trying to navigate my way through a very difficult situation involving a conflict of interest between management and trade unions. And I simply say to Mr Harvey that I think a bit more of that might help to try to resolve some of these issues that we face. What I would remind Mr Harvey that company regulation issues are reserved issues. The Scottish Government has no discretion over those points. We can apply particular conditions on regional selective assistance, which I have already set out in my answers to Parliament today, and we will continue to explore ways in which we can positively encourage a climate of effective industrial relations in Scotland to realise the ambitions that I've set out of creating the best possible working framework for employees in Scotland.
That ends the statement from the Cabinet Secretary on Grangemouth. The next item of business is a debate on motion number 8040 in the name of John Swinney on the Landfill Tax Scotland Bill. Members who wish to take part in the debate should press the request to speak buttons now. And I'll give the Cabinet Secretary, John Swinney, a couple of seconds to catch his breath. I call on Cabinet Secretary John Swinney to speak to move the motion. Mr Swinney, you've got 14 minutes.
Presiding Officer, as members will be aware, the Landfill Tax Scotland Bill is the second bill establishing devolved taxes in Scotland under the limited powers in the Scotland Act 2012. It follows the successful conclusion of the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax Bill, which was passed by Parliament in June and received royal assent at the end of July. This bill sets out the provisions and rules for a Scottish landfill tax that will replace the UK system of landfill tax in Scotland from April 2015. I am delighted that this bill has reached the milestone of the Stage 1 debate. I am grateful to the members of the Finance Committee for their work in preparing the report that has been published and welcome their support for the general principles of the bill. I responded yesterday to the Finance Committee on a number of the recommendations and issues that the committee had raised as part of its scrutiny of the bill. Both devolved taxes, the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax and the Scottish Landfill Tax, will be administered using powers that will be set out in a third bill, the Revenue Scotland and Tax Powers Bill, which is scheduled for introduction to Parliament before the end of this calendar year. Presiding Officer, I explained in a statement to this Chamber in June 2012 that we would establish Revenue Scotland to assess and collect devolved taxes. Revenue Scotland will work with the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, SEPA, to administer Scottish landfill tax. Revenue Scotland will serve the needs of the people of Scotland at a lower cost than would be possible were HMRC to administer these taxes, and we will deliver a better system more in line with Scotland's needs. In my statement to Parliament in June of last year, I set out the approach the Government is taking on taxation. These proposals are firmly founded on principles set out by Adam Smith in his inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations in 1776. Our approach is based on 4 maxims set out by Smith: the burden proportionate to the ability to pay, certainty, convenience and efficiency of collection. These principles provide the foundation for a system that will meet the needs of 21st century Scotland, along with this Government's core purpose of delivering sustainable economic growth for Scotland. It is the intention of the Government to use the responsibility we have on taxation to ensure that no one is asked to pay more than they can legitimately afford. Landfill tax is quite different in nature to other types of tax, such as the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax. Landfill tax acts as an encouragement towards finding other means of disposing of waste. I have already made clear to the Finance Committee my intention that the rates of landfill tax will be set at an appropriate level, no lower than that for the rest of the United Kingdom. Providing certainty about when and how much tax is due is an important guiding principle that underpins our approach. The consultation process for the Landfill Tax Bill has been extremely helpful and productive, and we will continue to engage with taxpayers and professionals as our proposals develop to ensure that tax changes have been properly discussed and communicated before being introduced. I have noted the desire of those within industry for as much certainty as possible with regard to the setting of tax rates. I have indicated to the Finance Committee that I am minded to make the proposed tax rates for landfill tax known in the budget of 2014, a number of months before the introduction of the tax in April 2015. Presiding Officer, one of the opportunities we have with the devolution of these tax responsibilities is the opportunity to create a simple and administratively efficient tax collection system. Revenue Scotland is working with SEPA on proposals to develop appropriate systems that are as straightforward and accessible as they can be to ensure that the approach to collecting Scottish landfill tax meets the needs of both taxpayers and tax authority. It is essential that our tax system should be efficient. It is clear that tax revenues must be devoted to paying for public services and not consumed in tax administration. The need for efficiency in the tax system is at the heart of our approach, and we will ensure that administrative costs are kept to a minimum. Turning now to the landfill tax bill itself, I want to see resource efficiency placed at the heart of our economy. The zero waste agenda in Scotland is thinking about moving resources from the margins to the mainstream. Our priorities for the future are supporting innovation and new ways of doing business as we move towards the creation of a circular economy. The actions we are already taking are helping businesses to save money and creating jobs and delivering economic growth. Landfill tax is a cornerstone of our zero waste plan, encouraging the prevention, reuse and recycling of materials and helping keep valuable resources circulating in the Scottish economy. So why is putting the value of resources at the heart of our economy so important? Very simply, it's because we live in a changing world, and this is placing new pressures on how we manage resources. The world economy is changing, with new major economic powers emerging in places like Brazil, India, Indonesia and Korea. The climate is changing globally. We are set to release another $500 billion tonnes of carbon emissions in the next few decades, and no part of our world will remain untouched by the impacts of climate change. And the population is changing. The global population is due to increase to 10.5 billion by 2075. That population is also becoming more affluent and increasingly urban, so much so that developing countries will build the equivalent of a city the size of Glasgow every 5 days from now to 2050. All of this means our demands for resources are changing. Globally, by 2030, we are expected to need 41% more water, 80% more steel and 33% more energy. And for some rare earth metals used in wind turbines, demand is expected to grow by up to 2,600%. It is no longer acceptable to throw these valuable resources into the ground where their value is lost forever. A Scottish landfill tax is essential in helping drive these materials out of landfill and back into the economy. Landfill tax can be seen as the first and most successful of the green taxes. It continues to change waste management practices. Alongside our zero waste plan and waste regulations, the tax will help deliver an economy where materials are reprocessed and remanufactured, helping achieve our aim of sustainable economic growth. The Scottish Government has given careful consideration to proposals for a landfill tax. Our proposals broadly reflect the existing UK landfill tax provisions, which are well understood by the waste industry and which appear to work reasonably well. The public consultation on our proposals ran from October last year through to January 2013, and we asked consultees about two key changes to landfill tax. The first of these is a proposed enhancement to the tax credit arrangements under which the Landfill Communities Fund operates. The fund, which operates at a UK level, supports good causes in the vicinity of landfill sites in response to bids from relevant organisations. The Landfill Tax Bill allows us to create a Communities Fund, and the detail of the fund will be set out in regulations and in guidance. However, I want to cover where my thinking is reached currently on the Communities Fund. And I stress that the Ministers have not reached a final conclusion on the details of the Communities Fund, and I look forward to listening to the views that are expressed by members today before formulating the further proposals that the Government brings forward. I recognise that the Communities Fund has been very successful, managing to lever match funding and help communities affected by landfill. I intend to set up a Scottish fund to replace the UK system that will maintain its private funding status and which will therefore be a useful and strong asset in securing match funding. This will mean the Scottish Fund will continue the good work of harnessing money for good quality projects, helping those communities most affected by landfill, but crucially leveraging resources from other sources to add to the resources that are created by the tax credit arising from the landfill tax. I will give way, yes.
John Mason. Thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. There has been some criticism of the UK system that the cost of administering it has been quite high, and does he think we'll be able to have a lower administrative cost in Scotland? Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Mr Mason for his intervention, and I recognise and acknowledge and agree with the concerns that have been expressed about the what appears to me to be a very cumbersome management arrangement in relation to the Communities Fund at UK level. So I have taken the decision to set up a Scottish fund, and an explicit requirement of that fund will be to significantly reduce the administrative costs that are involved in that process. And that's important for two reasons. Firstly, because of the legitimate issues that Mr Mason and others have raised on this question. But secondly, and as I will come on to in due course, the level of landfill tax proceeds will decline over time, and therefore the necessity of ensuring that we have a much more efficient and cost-efficient mechanism for managing the Communities Fund, which of itself will diminish in the years to come, is vitally important. Currently, the UK Fund gives taxpayers the opportunity to earn tax credits by making contributions to the fund. At present, these are capped at 6.8% of total tax liabilities in a year. As I explained to the Finance Committee, we propose to increase by 10% to 7.48% an operator's tax liability that can be offset by contributions to a separate Scottish fund. This was widely welcomed by those who responded to the consultation. We have also undertaken further consultation with stakeholders about how the fund can be administered. As we landfill less, and this is the point I was making with, to Mr Mason, less money will be available to the fund over the next decade. Increases in the credit cap will not offset the inevitable decline the role of landfill has to play in future waste management practices. I recognise that the current UK Landfill Communities Fund gives priority to community and biodiversity projects on the principle that those most affected by landfill should benefit most from the fund. I also recognise that landfill contributes a sizable part of Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions and to climate change impacts. In 2011, landfill emitted 600,000 metric tonnes of CO2 equivalent gases into the atmosphere. Furthermore, landfill encourages the production and transportation of new goods through the extraction and processing of virgin raw materials. This is an unsustainable and damaging production model. I am keen to hear the views of members about the funding objectives of a Scottish Landfill Communities Fund and how we secure the best outcomes. The current landfill tax arrangements are predicated around the principle that a 10-mile radius is applied to the sites of existing or redundant landfill sites, and the fund is generated is deployed in projects that are contained within that 10-mile radius. There has been much debate about the issue in the Finance Committee and within the consultation. On the one hand, I understand that community groups most affected by landfill want the 10-mile radius rule to apply to Scottish funds so that they benefit the most from it. I have also heard from environmental groups with an interest in biodiversity projects that they have highlighted that the reach of the fund could be extended and the rule should be lifted for biodiversity projects. I am keen to listen to the views expressed today during the debate on how we might take this point forward, and during the course of the passage of the bill, I will confirm the Government's developed thinking on this question. The second main change we propose for the fund is the taxation of illegal disposals of waste. We have several reasons for bringing this forward. Firstly, illegal dumping is a problem with significant environmental impacts. It's an environmental crime and it's rightly pursued and prosecuted as such. But the additional penalty of a tax charge on illegal disposals should act as a powerful disincentive and help prevent dumping. Secondly, illegal dumping undermines legitimate waste operators, including landfill operators. Our proposals will support and encourage the industry to operate responsibly. Third, by clamping down on tax evasion in this way, there is an opportunity to gather additional revenue without increasing the tax burden. Again, this proposal has been welcomed. Presiding Officer, there are two further points I want to make in the remaining time available to me. We propose that key elements of the landfill tax will be set out in secondary legislation, for example tax rates, detailed arrangements for tax credits and the operation of the Landfill Communities Fund, and the list of wastes that fall into the higher and lower tax bands. Taking this approach will enable the Scottish Government to consult properly on lists of waste materials and on the operation and administration of the tax. It will also provide flexibility to vary rates and make other changes without the need for primary legislation. I note that the Subordinate Legislation Committee has commented on our proposals and is broadly content with them. The second issue is to do with the overall effect of landfill tax on the Scottish budget. As the committee is aware, the impact on the budget of the devolved taxes depends on tax receipts offset by the amount of the block grant adjustment. As I mentioned earlier, I am minded to set the tax rate for the Scottish landfill tax at a level no lower than the rest of the UK to maintain stability and to provide certainty to companies operating in the sector. But as our zero waste policies continue to take effect, we expect to see tonnages to landfill decline further, and so tax receipts will also begin to fall. OBR's forecasts do not yet reflect this expected decline. One immediate challenge is to secure agreement to a block grant adjustment method that reflects the expected decline. This remains an unresolved issue with the UK Government, as the Spice briefing which the committee has made clear. I met with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury recently before his appearance at the Finance Committee, and he agrees that we need to find a resolution to this issue. Members will not be surprised to hear me say that I will continue to be closely involved in resolving this matter. I will do, yes.
Stuart Stevenson.
Does the Cabinet Secretary recognise that in Catalonia, for example, from 2004 to 2009, there was approximately a 20% reduction in their equivalent tax, which shows what can be done and what we might expect as we focus on reducing landfill?
I think the evidence, I think, speaks for itself on the effectiveness of the zero waste strategy in reducing the amount and the volume of waste that is going to landfill. And it is literally an arithmetic calculation, which of course my dear friend Mr Stevenson would be adept at performing on behalf of us all, that will be the pattern of revenues in the years to come, and that will have to be reflected in the block grant adjustment mechanism. Presiding Officer, in concluding, I am confident that we will have the legal and administrative systems in place in good time to collect a fair and robust landfill tax in Scotland from April 2015. I have covered today the approach that the Government has taken to the formation of the legislation and the issues that have been raised in the Finance Committee. I look forward to considering the points that are raised by Members of Parliament today as a consequence of the debate, and to engage further to resolve the issues that I have indicated still require resolution. It is therefore with pleasure, Presiding Officer, that I move that Parliament agrees to the general principles of the Landfill Tax Scotland Bill.
Many thanks. I now call on Kenneth Gibson to speak on behalf of the Finance Committee. Mr Gibson, 10 minutes or thereby.
Presiding Officer, I am pleased to debate the Landfill Tax Scotland Bill and highlight some key areas the Finance Committee considered during our Stage 1 scrutiny. The Scotland Act 2012 devolved a range of taxation and borrowing measures. The ability to borrow for capital projects, set a Scottish rate of income tax to replace a 10p in the pound reduction for Scottish taxpayers across all tax bands, powers to set taxes on land and building transactions and on disposals of waste to landfill. Our report identifies issues and themes that emerged from evidence we considered, and I will highlight some of these, starting with the tax framework. The Scottish Government has said that landfill tax will not be set at lower rates than the UK equivalent, and Mr Swinney just confirmed that. Scottish rates will mirror UK rates in 2015-16, meaning £80 per tonne for active materials and £2.50 for inert. Rates are not specified on the face of the bill to allow the Government flexibility to change them in future without primary legislation. The Cabinet Secretary mentioned certainty, but a number of witnesses raised concerns about uncertainty in relation to taxation rates on their financial planning. COSLA said, "It is essential that certainty exists, and where it does not, the financial risk to local authorities is appropriately mitigated by the Scottish Government." Similarly, the Scottish Environmental Services Association stated, "We represent an industry looking to make investment decisions for alternative non-landfill infrastructure, the viability of which will depend on what landfill tax will be, so it would have been nice to have an indication." The Cabinet Secretary said that whilst he had yet to decide on the timing of landfill tax, he is considering doing so around the time of the draft budget in September 2014, and he reaffirmed that again today. But we invite the Government to clarify why there is a need to wait until then, and would also welcome a confirmation of duration of the rates when announced will apply for, and will there be an escalator to those rates. An issue linked to rate setting is waste tourism, whereby waste might be transported across the border in either direction to take advantage of more favourable rates. RSPB Scotland explained that alternating rates may encourage cross-border transfer. Depending on the rates, this would either lead to a loss of revenue from Scotland or an increase in the amount of landfill waste within Scotland. The committee recognises the potential for such impacts should there be significant changes to the rates and structure of landfill tax, and we invite the Government to outline discussions it has had with the UK Environment Agency on this, and whether it has commissioned any research or analysis. As with LBTT, the Government reserves the power to make future changes to taxation rates via subordinate legislation. The bill provides that the first tax rates will be subject to affirmative procedure, and any future orders to the provisional affirmative procedure, which allows rate changes to come into force immediately. The committee welcomes the fact that changes will be subject to a form of affirmative procedure, and recognises there might be times when it is necessary for changes to have an immediate effect, for example in response to dramatic changes in market conditions. However, it is not clear why the standard affirmative procedure should not be used to set future rates in normal circumstances. For this reason, we ask the Government its rationale behind use of the provisional affirmative procedure, other than when speed is crucial. The bill also enables the Government to introduce additional rates of taxation for certain types of waste via secondary legislation. The evidence was generally in favour of this power, and the committee recommends the introduction of any additional rate be made subject to the affirmative procedure. Similarly, whilst there will initially be identical exemptions to those under the existing UK tax regime, the Government reserves its right to add or remove categories of waste to the exemption list. We heard suggestions that hazardous materials, such as asbestos, should be exempt to encourage safe disposal and reduce illegal dumping. The bill provides for additions to the list subject to the negative procedure, but given the potential for waste tourism, we recommend adjustments to the list be made subject to the affirmative procedure. Evidence was heard about the dangers of illegal landfill sites, which Mr Swinney also touched on. These damage the environment and are controlled by tax-dodging criminals invariably. Even when such illegal sites are discovered, court fines are often less than the tax evaded. The financial risks of getting caught outweigh the benefits, making such activity profitable and attractive to the unscrupulous. Had criminals been required to pay landfill tax, the fines would be much, much higher. Renfrewshire Council noted that their proposals will ensure that the punishment is more expensive than savings made from committing environmental crime. The committee therefore welcomes the taxing of unauthorised disposals to landfill. Nevertheless, whilst respondents were supportive, some suggested that regulatory and enforcement bodies like SEPA need additional resources to help identify such sites. SEPA said the problem required strong leadership and resources sufficient to ensure the fear of being caught is high. We seek clarification as to whether resources allocated to Revenue Scotland for compliance activity includes additional resources for SEPA to identify illegal sites. We also ask if any additional revenues collected as a result will be used to identify further illegal sites. Revenue Scotland, a body to be formally created by the Revenue Scotland and Tax Powers Bill we expect to scrutinise next year, will administer the new landfill tax and work with SEPA similar to how it works with the Registers of Scotland on LBTT. Witnesses agreed this approach is sensible, with RSPB Scotland stating its support, given the expertise and information SEPA currently hold with regard to landfill. We also had concerns relating to a potential skills gap at SEPA, with North Ayrshire Council stating that SEPA is an experienced environmental regulator rather than a tax assessor, and the Chartered Institute of Waste Management questioning whether it had the expertise to undertake a tax policing and revenue-raising role. SEPA acknowledged that staff require training and guidance to fulfil its new role and confirmed funding is in place to provide it. SEPA is confident any skills gap will disappear by April 2015. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee noted that the bill allows the Tax Authority to delegate functions to SEPA. Whilst it agreed this provision is sensible, it strongly recommends that publication of any delegation be required. The Finance Committee supports this and welcomes the Cabinet Secretary's commitment to look very carefully at the issue and respond to questions in the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee's report. A clear division of responsibilities between Revenue Scotland and SEPA is important, and we welcome confirmation that this will be defined and the committee will scrutinise it. Nevertheless, whilst recognising that the tax will not be implemented until April 2015, the committee seeks further clarification about the respective roles of Revenue Scotland and SEPA. As with LBTT, the committee will monitor and scrutinise implementation and delivery of the Scottish landfill tax, and we invited Revenue Scotland and SEPA to report on a 6-monthly basis. We will receive the first progress report from Revenue Scotland and Registers of Scotland on the implementation of LBTT at tomorrow's Finance Committee meeting. I now turn to the Landfill Communities Fund, which the Cabinet Secretary spent some time on earlier. At present, landfill operators can give up to 6.8% of their UK tax liabilities to fund community or environmental projects near landfill site. And as the Cabinet Secretary indicated, the bill makes provision for creation of a similar Scottish fund and for a 10% increase in the credit gap. We are pleased that the Government will introduce a new Scottish cap of 7.48%. Concerns were raised about regulation of the existing fund, with the Scottish Wildlife Fund suggesting it was expensive, duplicated information gathering and is over-regulated. The Scottish Landfill Community Fund Forum agreed that current regulatory requirements were extremely onerous and time-consuming. The committee is therefore pleased that the Government will consider how to administer the fund more efficiently. But to receive funding now, a site should be no more than 10 miles from a landfill site. Some witnesses suggested that as a number of active sites declines, this should be reconsidered, perhaps to consider disruption and pollution caused by transportation of waste through communities en route to sites. Others pointed out that the fund was relatively small and retention of the 10-mile criteria important, indeed crucial. The committee noted arguments for and against, conscious that local factors vary from place to place. Whilst 10 miles may seem a distance in Glasgow, it may not be in rural and sparsely populated areas. Considering these views, the committee endorsed the principle that those most affected by landfill sites should benefit most. For this reason, we welcome the Bill team's suggestion that something a little more sophisticated might be needed. that will hopefully attract the match funding the Cabinet Secretary mentioned earlier. We ask the Government to update us on progress with this and look forward to considering proposals via secondary legislation in advance of the bill's implementation. We recommend that such secondary legislation be subject to the affirmative procedure. Now, members will know that the OBR is responsible for forecasting Scottish tax receipts for the Scottish rate of income tax, LBTT and landfill tax. It provided 3 forecasts for Scottish receipts from landfill tax from 2011-12 to 2007-18, with the second and third much lower than the first. Whilst the OBR anticipates landfill tax revenues remaining broadly level from 2015, the Scottish Government expects significant decline, partly due to its environmental policies. It predicts receipts will fall from £107 million in 2015-16 to around £40.5 million in 2025. As the block grant will be subject to a one-off reduction, the committee believes it important that any reduction in tax receipts does not penalise Scotland. I'm on my last minute. If I'm able to, I'm happy to.
Yes, you may.
I wonder if the member is aware that in Sweden, between the year 2000 and 2009, the tax take dropped to 1/5 of the original figure because of success in their programmes in tackling waste, and that if Scotland's ambitions are also realised, we will be in that similar place.
Kenneth Gibson.
Well, it appears then that the Scottish Government's policies are fairly conservative and that it envisages only a 60% reduction. But clearly, from what you've said, it is really important then that we have effective negotiations with the UK Government, and indeed that forecasting is accurate so that Scotland doesn't actually lose out, as I've indicated. The committee recently published its report on implementing the Scotland Act's 2012 financial powers. Amongst other things, it emphasised the importance of forecast methodology and data being published, transparent and open to scrutiny, and asked whether the proposed new independent forecasting body will be established in time to predict landfill tax receipts in advance of the 2015-16 draft budget. If not, which forecasts would be used to inform the document? Presiding Officer, the committee reflected carefully on the evidence and supports the general principles of the bill. I look forward to hearing from other members and the Cabinet Secretary when he winds up the debate. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now call on Ian Gray, 10 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I rise to support the general principles of the Landfill Tax Scotland Bill. I think that those who see this as a rather dull and dry piece of revenue legislation, perhaps of more interest to accountants than agitators, miss the point on several counts. For this is, of course, the latest instalment in the greatest devolution of power to this Parliament since its creation in 1999. And as the Cabinet Secretary did briefly allude to, the bill comes before us as a direct result of the Scotland Act 2012, itself the legacy of the Calman Commission. That was an agitation worthy of the name when this Parliament audaciously seized power from the then minority administration and simply bypassed the executive arm of Scottish Government to deliver first the Commission, then its wide-ranging recommendations, and then successfully a negotiation of their implementation with the UK Government and the Westminster Parliament. And of course, we should remember that that was not the first shift in power between parliaments. Indeed, that has been a constant feature of devolution, with the most significant example, perhaps prior to 2012, being the shifting of responsibility for rail infrastructure, along with several hundreds of millions of pounds every year, I think £300 million at the time, which went with that. Of course.
John Mason.
I thank the member for giving way, and I agree with him. We do welcome these additional powers. Would you agree with me that it's been disappointingly slow at the rate powers have come to this Parliament?
Ian Gray.
Well, I actually think not. And indeed, the next point that I wanted to make rather contradicts Mr Mason's point, because I think an examination of the years of devolution would show that the reality of devolution is that powers have shifted on an almost daily basis. There are examples around, for example, responsibility for the regulatory framework around offshore wind as that industry developed and became more mature. The most recent examples perhaps are the devolution of council tax benefit and crisis loans parts of the benefits system, the devolution of those areas of that system to Scotland within the last year or so. So, no, I think it's something which has happened as and when the circumstances have demanded it. And that flexibility is, of course, what Rhodri Morgan, for it was he, what Rhodri Morgan meant when he called devolution a process and not an event. I do make the point, though, that the Calman changes are qualitatively different in that they begin substantially to address what the Commission identified as the greatest weakness of the 1998 Scotland Act. And that was that, by international comparisons, that legislation devolved a remarkable degree of legislative power to this Parliament, but much less fiscal power than we see in other examples of devolution around the world. So these changes are intended to redress that imbalance, and that's a shift of principle, not just a shift of administrative convenience. Landfill tax was identified by the Commission as ripe for devolution for two reasons. Firstly, it is a tax based in place, specifically where the landfill is sited, and it is therefore immobile and defined by geography. But secondly, it is a taxation whose purpose is fundamentally related to policy areas which already were the purview of this Parliament in the form of pursuing sustainability, reducing environmental damage and greater efficiency in the management of waste, and indeed to play our part in addressing climate change, a global challenge, as the Cabinet Secretary described in his opening remarks. This tax is a crucial lever in the drive to increase recycling and the reuse of our resources and to cut the emissions which damage the planet on which we live. So the bill may read like something less than epic verse, but it nonetheless exemplifies a powerful argument that we should exercise this power, and that our devolution settlement is flexible enough to ensure that we do. That is, of course, an argument which the Scottish Government find sometimes inconvenient for their ambitions, and thus they did resist it to the last gasp. But in the spirit of working on common ground, I'm happy that they have embraced it and that we have reached this landmark today, and I commend their efforts to get this bill in place so that we're ready for April 2015, when the UK landfill tax will be switched off. The bill does, of course, leave many questions begged, though. It is framework legislation with little or no detail as to how ministers plan to deploy the new tax. Most obviously, beyond indicating, as he did again today, that the rates will be set at levels no lower than the UK rates at the time of transfer, the Cabinet Secretary has said that September 2014 is the earliest we will know what the opening rate for the tax will be. Now, both business and local government have sought an earlier indication, and since this is a new tax, a change, that would seem to me not unreasonable and potentially a significant help in providing some reassurance. I do understand that taxes can change at any time in the future, but perhaps the Cabinet Secretary in these circumstances might reconsider whether an earlier indication would be possible. And of course, this is one of those curious taxes which, if they succeed, will deliver less and less income to government, and the government's forecasts do properly reflect that. But we've seen figures today that only 9 councils have met their recycling targets, with some recycling less last year than the year before, not more. So it is a tax which I think we do have to consider how it actually works. And, this is our key lever to transform that situation. And it would be, I think, a little more convincing if ministers were perhaps a little less cautious and more imaginative in explaining now how they intend to use their new power to use the tax differently and set new and different rates to do exactly that. After all, that would be no more than the Cabinet Secretary did in introducing the land and building transaction tax, where he took that opportunity to create a more progressive regime than the one he inherited, something that we supported. One very welcome change, though, to the landfill tax is the power referred to by the Cabinet Secretary to tax as well as fine illegal landfill sites. Once again, there is a lot of detail to hear about how that will be enforced and what additional resources SEPA might have at their disposal to pursue that additional revenue, and we look forward to hearing more about that in the passage, during the passage of the bill. There are many outstanding questions too about the landfill community fund, and I welcome the fact that the Cabinet Secretary today indicated an open-mindedness about how we might change and reform that aspect of landfill taxation. Certainly the increase to 7.34% of tax liability available for the fund is indeed a very welcome one. For constituencies like mine, where landfill does take place, these credits can be a very important source of support for local communities. In East Lothian, it funds very diverse activities, from the Highs, Haddington Athletic Football Club, to probably the higher flying Puffins, or rather the Seabird Centre fighting back against tree mallow on the islands of Craigleith and Fidra. I think that the 10-mile limit is just that. It is a limit, and Kenny Gibson is right when he says that, particularly in rural Scotland, 10 miles is not really a very great distance. And so it does seem to me that we could relax it without losing the principle of those communities affected being the ones who benefit altogether. For example, by extending eligibility to the whole of the local authority area where landfill takes place. And that would take some account too of the transportation of the waste to the landfill site as well. So, Deputy Presiding Officer, we're very pleased to see this legislation move forward, but have some concerns about the many questions its drafting still begs. I do accept that primary legislation can suffer from too much as well as too little detail, and the Finance Committee made their point too. But their resolution to this, I think, was the right one, which was to say that, in their view, changes and the orders regarding, for example, new rates should be subject to affirmative procedure and therefore proper and appropriate scrutiny at the time they come forward. That was a point the Finance Committee made effectively during the passage of the Land and Buildings Transition Tax Bill, and ministers accepted it in that case and agreed the argument, and I think they should do so in this case as well. So, Presiding Officer, as with much of our legislation, the dullness is in the detail. But in passing the principles of this bill this afternoon, as I'm sure that we shall, we should not lose sight of the fact that it is but the latest indication that our devolution settlement is a powerful, flexible and dynamic democratic model, and one worth fighting to keep.
Many thanks. Now call on Gavin Brown. Up to 7 minutes, please, Mr Brown.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Working on this bill through the Finance Committee has been pretty interesting and rewarding at times as well. And I think the overall direction of travel from the Scottish Government at this stage has been the right one. I think they broadly attempt to replicate the existing landfill tax, which is UK-wide as it stands, but with some tweaks, I think, to improve in areas where that tax isn't working quite as effectively as it might have done. But I want to focus my remarks in this speech just on some of the areas that have been highlighted by the committee, where I think there are policy decisions to be made by the government and the Parliament as a whole, and areas where I think some further information from the government is required in order to allow Parliament and indeed the committee as well to make decisions about the best way, not just to implement this bill, but to look more widely at the secondary legislation that will go behind what is a framework bill. The first one is in relation to tax rates, and as with any tax, the tax rates gather a lot of comment. The reviews put forward, of course, by practitioners on all sides. But I do wonder if the Scottish Government, at this early stage, can answer one question, because I think the public statements leave open the possibility for confusion. The official position from the Scottish Bill team giving evidence was that it will not set tax rates lower than those in place for the UK landfill tax, which is pretty close to, I think, what the Cabinet Secretary said in his remarks today. But the financial memorandum for the bill itself says the Scottish tax rates will mirror the UK rates in 2015-16. Now, those two things may be exactly the same thing, but equally they may not be the same thing. By saying it's no lower, it could be the same or higher. And I wonder if this, whereas mirroring suggests it will be identical. I just wonder if at this early stage, either in his closing or fairly soon, the Cabinet Secretary can say whether they actually mean they will literally mirror the UK rates in 2015-16, or is it simply a case of they could well be higher in 15-16. To me, it's not 100% clear at this stage. We heard that we would get the... Sure, happy to give way.
John Mason.
I thank the member for giving way. I just wonder if he's not making a bit more of this than actually is the case. I mean, my reading of it at face value was it's not going to be any lower, so that's a commitment. And mirroring means not exactly the same, perhaps, but very close. So between that, I mean, that gives me really quite a lot of clarity about where we're going.
That may give comfort to Mr Mason. I merely put it out there in the public record that I think it would be helpful if we got just a bit more clarity from the Scottish Government, if clarity is indeed available. I think also it would be helpful to know from the Scottish Government, we've heard that the initial rates or initial information will be given in the autumn of 2014 in advance of the 15-16 budget being set. At this stage, does the Cabinet Secretary have a view on the period of time for which rates will be set? COSLA said to the committee in their submission, we would suggest that 5 years in advance would be most appropriate. I think North Ayrshire Council suggested 3 years. I just wonder whether the Scottish Government is intending to set it for several years, or will it be a single-year period? Their response to the committee that came out either yesterday or today suggested that it would be looked at specifically year on year. I just wonder at this stage, are they going to tell us how it will be set for a period of years or simply just for 1 year? Deputy Presiding Officer, the issue of waste tourism, I think, is a critical one and one which, quite rightly again, attracted comment throughout the committee. This is where there are differences, of course, between Scotland and the rest of the UK and can lead to waste being taken from one part of the UK to another. We were told that the committee would be surprised at how small the differential in tax rates would be for it to be cost-effective to move waste. What I think would be interesting to know, and which the committee has called for, what work has the Scottish Government specifically done in this regard, and can they actually publish the work that has been done so that the committee and indeed Parliament can have a clear view on how many pounds per tonne difference starts to make an impact where it's higher in one part of the United Kingdom than another. That will have an impact on a whole range of things, whether it's the rates we set as a whole, the number of rates, whether that ultimately gets changed, the materials included under each rate, and indeed exemptions applied to rates. So it will be interesting to hear what work has been done and whether it can be published so that we can take our own views on it. Deputy Presiding Officer, like others, I welcome the... Sure, happy to take one.
Stuart Stevens.
Is the member aware of Council Directive 1999-31 EC and Section 11? I'm sure he'll have read it intensely. And Section 11 specifically addresses the issue of differences between regimes, not just in Europe but worldwide. It suggests, in effect, that it would be perfectly proper to legislate to prevent such movements from a regime with tighter environmental controls to one with less tight environmental controls. Would you support the Scottish Parliament having appropriate powers to do that?
Gavin Brown.
Presiding Officer, the member is on fire today, isn't he? We're hearing from Catalonia, Sweden and some old directives as well. I think the serious point is what would be helpful is a 2013 analysis on what the Scottish Government believes the position to be, so that as we finalise this legislation and indeed the secondary legislation underneath it, we get a clear picture on how waste tourism might be affected with a differential rate. Like others, Deputy Presiding Officer, I welcome the move to allow unauthorised disposals to be taxed. This, of course, makes the operation less attractive and could have an impact on unauthorised sites, which I think everybody, all stakeholders across the spectrum, would be against. But I think there is a serious question for the Government to answer here, and I don't think it's quite come out in their response to the Finance Committee. Is the policy objective here to simply give SEPA the power to go after unauthorised sites and indeed collect tax from those unauthorised sites instead of merely fines, which is the current position. Are SEPA expected to just visit the same number of sites that they currently visit, but we get additional revenue from them doing so? Or is there a policy objective here to actually intensify and increase the number of sites that SEPA can visit, the amount of work that they can do in those individual sites, so that we collect additional tax, not just from existing sites, but from potentially many, many more in the future? If it's the latter, then I think it would be interesting to hear about what resources are required for that. Deputy Presiding Officer, I'll leave it there just now. Suffice to say that we'll certainly be supporting the bill at stage 1 at 5 o'clock today. Thank you.
Many thanks. And we now move to open debate. Can we have 6-minute speeches, please? Jamie Hepburn, to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and in welcoming today's debate, can I begin by congratulating the Cabinet Secretary on managing to finagle a mention of Adam Smith into his opening contribution. I have to say, as someone who studied his works in a former capacity as a student at Glasgow University, I didn't ever imagine that I would hear his name mentioned in a debate on waste management in the Scottish Parliament. I think that's the ultimate triumph of his opening contribution. Can I also say I do think this debate is welcome. When we had the debate on land and buildings transaction tax, I think we all spoke of it being historic in the sense of it being the first time we had debated a new Scottish tax in this place, in this Parliament, and it being a new chapter in the story of devolution. I suppose we can't quite describe this tax in the same historic terms because it is just managed to come up as the runner-up in the historical posterity stakes, but it is still important mainly for the reasons that have been set out thus far as part of the general sweep of the devolution of new taxation powers to this place. I want to focus on a few things that have arisen through stage 1 consideration of this bill in the Finance Committee, of which I am a member. I think the first point is that it's very sensible to have this tax devolved. It makes a lot of sense. We can align this tax with the climate change ambitions of this Parliament. I think it's been well remarked upon the ambitious nature of the climate change legislation that this Parliament has passed, and encouraging greater recycling activities surely got to be part of that effort. And clearly the landfill tax, its core aim is to transfer waste from being disposed of in landfill to being recycled instead. So it makes sense to me that we have control over that activity and that taxation here at the Scottish Parliament. Can I also welcome the announcement through, and it's been reiterated again today, but it was set out with the Cabinet Secretary at the stage 1 consideration of the bill, that he will ensure that the Act acts against encouraging waste tourism by setting rates of this tax at appropriate levels. If this tax is to be used as a mechanism for ensuring environmental improvement, then it would be entirely counterproductive to see waste transported across jurisdictions. It would make no sense at all. Can also welcome the provision in the bill to provide a disincentive to illegal dumping, which is, of course, currently and will remain a criminal activity subject to anyone undertaking such activity being fined. But, of course, at the present, under the present taxation arrangements, there is no mechanism for also levying the tax that would be owed, and often a fine may be less than the tax that was owed. And clearly this bill would ensure that anyone who dumped waste illegally would also continue to be subject to criminal proceedings, but also have to pay the tax as well as any fine incurred. I think that's a sensible move, and it seems strange to me actually that the UK Government hasn't itself taken this step previously. I think it's welcome that the Scottish Government is doing so now. Can also welcome the continued importance of the Landfill Communities Fund as part of this bill. I think we're all aware that many local organisations have benefited by this funding. I think it's probably the most visible element of the landfill tax in many localities. Indeed, my own area, there have been organisations who have benefited, and that is, of course, from my perspective, very welcome. I know there is obviously some debate about the distance from landfill activity by which an organisation should be able to apply for that funding. I know Michael McMahon, who is on the committee, was particularly assiduous in pursuit of that issue at stage 1, given the range of landfill activity that takes place in his constituency. I think it's sensible that there is a degree of flexibility, but I do think it's right that those areas that have been affected by landfill should be the primary beneficiaries. I think there are greater opportunities for this fund with the devolution of the tax. The Cabinet Secretary was able to set out to the Finance Committee at stage 1 consideration that Scotland's share of landfill tax receipts as a percentage of the total UK tax take since 1996-97 was 9.2%, but we received 7%, only 7% of the UK Government's landfills community fund to projects in Scotland. So clearly there is an opportunity for organisations to benefit more by the devolution of this taxation. And also I think the issue that was raised by John Mason in terms of ensuring a more cost-effective administration of the fund is sensible. I think the Cabinet Secretary was right to call it cumbersome. I think this primarily relates in terms of the audit of the fund holders. This was an issue that was raised by those who had administered the funds when they gave evidence to the committee. And again, it surely has to be potential for more funds for organisations to be released. We can do that, can undertake administration of the funds more effectively, and I look forward to seeing what is suggested by the Scottish Government. The last issue I want to raise very briefly, because I see I don't have much time, President Officer, is the block grant adjustment for landfill tax. This is going to be crucially important. The Chief Secretary of the Treasury, when he came to committee, told us that he wanted it based on forecasts. I would just gently say that the OBR, I think, has been unable to provide a coherent and sensible forecast in relation to this area of taxation activity. So I hope that the UK Government will agree a fair mechanism. I look forward to seeing what emerges there and look forward to considering this bill at stage 2. Thank you, President Officer.
Thank you very much. Now call on Malcolm Chisholm to be followed by John Mason.
Presiding Officer, the landfill tax has been a fairly successful environmental tax at a UK level, with a 30% reduction in the amount of waste sent to landfill since 1997. And that reduction has been driven to a significant extent by the tax escalator for this tax, and I hope that will become a feature of the Scottish landfill tax as well. Unfortunately, we don't know about the escalator, and in fact we don't know very much about the rates at all, except that there will be no lower than currently under the UK system. Now, this uncertainty, as the Committee Convener Kenny Gibson reminded us, was criticised at committee by a range of bodies, including COSLA and the Scottish Environmental Services Association. They argued that it made investment decisions difficult, while the Cabinet Secretary at committee said that rates didn't drive investment. I would gently put it to the Cabinet Secretary, however, that rates are not entirely irrelevant to investment, and I hope that he will take on board the recommendations of the committee about clarifying why he won't make an announcement before September, and also hopefully saying something before then about whether he will adopt an escalator and over how long a period he will announce tax rates for. Now, it's not the only uncertainty around this. There is also uncertainty about how much landfill tax revenue is currently raised in Scotland, and we certainly can't blame the Cabinet Secretary for that. There are no directly available data on the Scottish share of landfill tax, and the 9.2% of UK revenues that has been bandied about in committee and elsewhere is solely derived from data on the quantity of waste sent to landfill in Scotland, and that's data collected by SEPA. Now, the OBR uses that 9.2% estimate for its estimate about Scottish landfill tax revenues. It does its estimate of the UK and takes 9.2% of that for Scotland. And as we've already heard, there is a degree of concern, particularly about the initial projections of the OBR for the next 2 or 3 years, which were wildly unbelievable. They've now adjusted that, but clearly this is an important issue for the block grant adjustment. So I do hope that the OBR will look seriously at the Scottish Government's projection of reduction to 40 million by 2025, which seems credible, even conservative, as Kenny Gibson says. We better make sure we don't take that remark out of context in his description of Scottish Government policy. So I would support the Scottish Government in terms of urging the smallest possible block grant reduction, because I do think the whole point of this tax is to drive down revenues, which seems paradoxical from a Treasury point of view, but entirely sensible from an environmental point of view. Now, from an environmental point of view, our instinct would be to drive hard on this tax to reduce waste as quickly as possible. But there are two constraints. Firstly, of course, we've got to be mindful that we don't encourage illegal dumping. And secondly, we have to remember the waste tourism issue. So these constraints have to be taken into account when considering if we're going to have different rates from the UK, or different bans from the UK, or different exceptions from the UK. For example, if we have a different rate that's too high, we might actually collect less revenue because people would then take their waste to England. Different bans, for example, SEPA has recommended that incinerated bottom ash should be at the top level. Seems like a good recommendation, but maybe people will just go and take all that to England. And finally, in terms of different exceptions, there is a lot of merit in saying no rate for asbestos at all, because we don't want illegal dumping. But if we have no rate for asbestos, we might get all of England's asbestos as well. So these matters have to be very carefully weighed up. And I certainly support the committee recommendations that any decisions on additional rates or removing exceptions have to be by affirmative, because they are really quite difficult and complex decisions. Now, one thing that we do know is that there's going to be a tax on illegal dumping as well as a fine, and I strongly welcome that along with the committee, although perhaps the Cabinet Secretary can clarify what additional revenues might be available to SEPA if they have the enforcement function in relation to that. They said in reply to a question, I think from me in the committee, that the 300,000 they have would not cover any enforcement activity. And more generally, I think we need some clarification of the respective rules of SEPA and Revenues Scotland when it comes to this. I'm glad they're working together, but they need to work out exactly where the demarcation lines are. Now, finally, one means of mitigating the impact of landfill at a local level is the Landfill Communities Fund, which the Cabinet Secretary described in some detail in his speech. I'm pleased that the current system of providing landfill operators with tax credits in exchange for a percentage of tax liability will be followed, and that the 6.8% of liabilities under the current system will be boosted by 10% by the Scottish Government, so that is certainly welcomed. However, evidence to the committee by the Land Communities Fund Forum and others suggested that many areas that could benefit from this support are put off by an overly complicated application process. And therefore, if the fund is to be properly benefited from under the new regime, we should look to simplify the system. SEPA, for example, said the regulation was top-heavy and it could be streamlined, and I welcome the fact that Cabinet Secretaries listened to them and made the announcement about that today. Now, finally, on the point of the eligibility radius, there is some tension between looking to more creative ways to reduce environmental impacts across Scotland and compensating communities that are closer and therefore more adversely impacted directly by the consequences of landfill. I would err on the side of caution and suggest that in terms of environmental justice, any finite funding should be distributed among these communities. And I think that is consistent with the community's recommendation, which is my last sentence, you'll be glad to know, Presiding Officer, which supported the principle of those most affected benefiting the most.
Many, many thanks. Now call on John Mason to be followed by Hans Alan Malik. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Yesterday, one of my staff was speaking to somebody else and said that, to them that I was the only MSP that was actually interested in landfill tax. But I think that was a bit unfair, because I know that the Finance Committee has been quite enthusiastic about it, Mr Chisholm included, although he sometimes hides it, and Mr Brown and Mr Swinney and so on. But we should not underestimate the significance of this tax, of this Parliament gaining tax-raising powers, albeit the vast majority of taxes are still controlled by Westminster. Whatever happens in 2014, 15 and 16, this Parliament is not satisfied with the powers it has, will not be satisfied with the powers it has been promised, and will press for the people in Scotland to make more decisions for Scotland. And although in the scheme of things this is a relatively small tax, it is an important one, as it brings together environmental policy, revenue raising, support for local communities, to name but three. With all the taxes in Scotland, we need to be aware, of course, with any taxes in Scotland, we need to be aware, of course, what our neighbours are doing, and especially what England is doing. We might want to have a higher tax, as Malcolm Chisholm was pointing out. For example, higher landfill tax means it's good for the environment, but there's little point if that only shifts waste across the border, and we also suffer a loss of revenue. The evidence at committee was that even small differences in rates could lead to waste tourism, and we need to guard against that, both on a cross-border basis, but also, of course, between the mainland and islands within Scotland. I think the answer on challenges that the islands face is correctly that we deal with different exemptions for them and perhaps slightly less strict standards in some cases, rather than having different rates for different parts of the country. So it seems to me that the statement that Scottish rates will mirror UK rates and that the rate will be no lower than the UK rate in 2015 is pretty clear. Yes, absolutely.
Stuart Stevenson.
Back to the Council Directive of 1999, is he aware that Article 2 specifically makes a provision for communities of no more than 500 inhabitants per municipality, or where they are more than 50 kilometres from an appropriate place where waste may be deposited? I wonder if we're actually doing as much as we may be permitted under the directive.
John Mason.
Well, I think you'd have to ask people better placed than myself as to whether we're doing as much as we could be. But I still think the line of direction that the bill takes and the present situation whereby there are slightly different standards for islands and remote communities is fair. Now, there have been calls for greater certainty about rates and so on, and I have to say I do think a lot of this is crying wolf, in my opinion. Neither in the UK nor in Scotland can there be complete certainty about the future. One of the key aims of both governments is to reduce waste, be that by actually reducing, reusing, recycling, all of these words, but that is notoriously hard to predict. The tenements in my own constituency recently got grey recycling bins for food, but my estimate is that it takes some time for people to get used to this. And in fact, let me just finish that point, some time for people to get used to this, and in some cases I have seen the little buckets, the little collection waste receptacles being used as mini buckets to store mops in, which is not what they're intended for. And so there's always some degree of resistance to these kind of changes. Mr Brown.
Gavin Brown.
I'm wondering if he was on the committee when he and all the committee signed up to statements such as the committee notes the concerns of witnesses and invites the government to clarify reasons. The committee asks the government to provide greater clarity. Did he think it was crying wolf when he signed up to the committee's report?
John Mason.
Well, of course, obviously, I've been thinking about the report every day, as I'm sure he has, since we actually wrote it. But no, I mean, the point is, if we can have more clarity, of course we're all happy to have more clarity. But I think there needs to be a little bit of realism as we talk about the future, not just with landfill tax, but in other areas too, that we do not have facts about the future. We can make projections, we can make estimates, we can have a vision, but we do not know all the facts about the future, and I think we have to be realistic about that. On unauthorised disposals, it's very much welcome that both tax and fines will have to be paid in future, and clearly SEPA have a key role in this. And we see both small and large-scale dumping throughout the country, I'm afraid, and that, I think we all agree, needs to be clamped down on. I think the resources of SEPA need to be kept under review, as this is an area of major concern, I think, for all of our constituents. And I do welcome the government's response, which says, quote, funding will take account of a range of factors, including compliance activity. On the block grant adjustment, this is clearly one of the trickiest areas when introducing this tax. Logically, the revenue received should be falling, but the OBR has predicted cash income staying level. The Scottish Government response that receipts could fall by 74% between 15-16 and 24-25 is pretty dramatic, and I certainly hope it can be achieved. But the block grant adjustment must take account of this. Clearly, all three block grant adjustments are subject of negotiation between the Scottish and UK governments. And while my preference would be to see a distinct, transparent solution for each of the three taxes, I do accept that landfill tax is relatively smaller, and the Scottish Government may want to trade off a poorer settlement on one tax for a better settlement on another one. On the 10-mile radius, just very briefly, I think that is probably too narrow in a rural area, but is almost certainly too wide in an urban area. So the Bill team's statement in paragraph 105 that something a little more sophisticated is needed is very welcome. So in conclusion, this is the second of the proposed tax bills under the Scotland Act. I very much welcome the more control coming to Scotland in this area. We have to accept that we have limited room for manoeuvre on landfill tax, but we do need to tackle this huge problem of waste which we face, and I do believe this bill gives us the opportunity to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call Hansala Malik to be followed by Rob Gibson.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to speak about the landfill tax and its implications for Scotland's long-term future. Taxation and waste are not issues that capture the public imagination. However, Tesco's produced a report in which it announced that amongst the food waste it includes figures more than 2/3 of bagged salad is thrown away. It has shocked many people. I am taking Tesco as an example, as a substantial part of this waste occurs in the processing of food, and the waste to reduce processing needs to be changed. We must take steps to reduce that element of waste. Therefore, for many companies, the reduction of waste is a matter of medium-term planning, in addition to financial implications and investment required for waste. Companies in developing strategy of landfill are long-term investment requires investment and positive decision-making. Hence, the issue of uncertainty over the exactly what the landfill tax will be beyond 2015 is in fact an issue that we will need to grapple with. When questioned by the Finance Committee, the Cabinet Secretary said that there are independent of the landfill tax rate, but whether the Scottish people throw away things that these companies can make profit from, it's a question from yourself, Cabinet Secretary. My understanding is that both in these things are important for companies to make long-term financial projections and pay investments such as alternatives to landfills also. It is much easier for the Scottish Government to increase certainty by setting a landfill tax rate, say 3 years in advance. Whether we will see the need for a crystal ball to estimate exactly what Scots will chuck away is another issue. On another note, the consultative report shows widespread support for landfill communities fund, LCF, which is funded by the landfill tax. This fund allows managers of landfill sites to give money for environmental communities and build heritage projects within a 10-mile radius of landfill sites or operational depots. I would like to take this opportunity to stress that the 10-mile radius rule should be more flexible, enabling a wider group of community organizations to accept the fund and make good use of them. And it's already been highlighted, one or two colleagues have suggested, particularly in rural areas, but I think it's right across Scotland we would benefit by that. So this bill will allow us to develop a clear management structure, and that should be regular updates on the fund's administered to avoid duplication as it happens at present. And the tax tariff on landfill should be allowed to be flexible, allowing a realistic taxation, encouraging industries to participate, invest, to allow alternative use of landfill sites so that we can have a better future for not only our industry but also our citizens. And last but not least, Presiding Officer, I think it's important that we recognise that the waste in Scotland is costing this nation a lot of unnecessary burden in terms of our resources. And therefore, it is important that we continue to ensure that we play with industry a serious role so that we don't burden the industry on its own. I think the government has a responsibility to share its views and its aspirations with industry, working hand in glove to make sure that we take full and proper advantage of, one, reducing our waste, two, addressing the landfill sites that we currently have, three, in terms of the taxation levels that are going to be in place, four, the prediction of the fact that landfill sites taxes are in fact going to reduce in the future. So what we need to do is to, although that's a good sign, but it also affects community groups, and we need to see how those community groups would be benefit, how they will then be supported in the future as well. Thank you very much.
Many thanks. I now call Rob Gibson, who will be followed by Michael McMahon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. For my point of view in the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee, obviously the bill will help Scotland meet its world-leading climate change targets by aligning tax with environmental policy. I think I could put it no better than the Scottish Wildlife Trust did in its briefing, when it says, while waste disposal by landfill is still carried out in Scotland, the Trust is in favour of having a tax fund which goes some way to compensate for the environmental harm which arises from landfill, which is used to fund biodiversity projects that help to restore ecosystems to health, and amenity projects which improve access to wildlife for communities. That's a tall order for a small amount of money, but remarkably, major projects have taken place that have allowed these principles to be carried out. But the bill will help to make sure that we're establishing a tax system that supports the use of taxes and charges in environmental policy. Indeed, the RSPB suggests that it's a good working example of a hypothecated or ring-fence tax. It's compensated for an environmentally damaging activity by funding projects which improve the environment for the benefit of biodiversity and the communities who live near landfill sites. That being said, it's important that we take a look at the way in which this will apply in terms of the zero waste plan, because the zero waste plan allows us to think in terms of promoting high levels of recycling and diverting materials and resources from landfill into more sustainable forms of use or treatment. Yes,
Jenny Mara.
The member for giving way, and I do agree with him that the landfill tax is an important part of helping Scotland achieve its RPP ambitions. But would you agree with me it's a small part of this project, and actually it needs a lot more focused direction and commitment from the Scottish Government across a range of policy issues, including transport and housing, to get anywhere near the targets that the Government has committed itself to?
Rob Gibbs.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't agree with you, because I think we're talking about specific kinds of projects about which I will give you some examples just now that allow private money to be applied in a fashion that has a public good, because that's basically what this money is. It's not come from the public purse directly. So what I would suggest is that we think about the way in which we align the tax with the zero waste plan. The zero waste plan's aim is to help people reduce. Now, that means that we're looking at communities which are often, in my constituency, 70 or 80 miles from a landfill site. Indeed, it may be that the landfill site is in Perthshire, not in Highland at all. So we're having to deal with a situation where people have to be encouraged to reduce and to recycle. But if they have to landfill, then there are huge journeys that are required in order to take that landfill material to the site for disposal. So in that case, I think we should recognise that there's a need to ask, where does the material come from when we're making up decisions about where the money should be spent from this in the Landfill Communities Fund. And some of the examples which I have from my own constituency include, I was at the opening of the Scottish Wildlife Trust's path improvements at Benmore Coigach near Achildebui some years ago. That is a small community which would produce very little landfill. Indeed, I would hope that any materials that were taken down from old houses were used for the foundations of new houses and would never end up in landfill. But the point is that that's an example there. There are many around the country which we could point out. Commonhead Moss, also an SWT project which improved the peat bog habitat there, and so on. So many of these sites are far from areas with landfill. And therefore, we have to ask ourselves, should the eligibility radius of 10 miles be reviewed in terms of areas like my own? Now, the RSPB has made a major point about the fact that it feels that there has to be flexibility, and I'm glad that the Cabinet Secretary indicated that that was going to be something he would take into account before the final stages of this bill. Let me say that from the point of view of my committee, we really need to think about making as practical and simple a measures as possible that allow the transfer of monies in this fashion. Therefore, this would take into account the geographical breadth of ecosystems and that the related projects are applied to. And if that's the case, then in the Highlands we have to think about a much larger area than the one which we were talking about there. So I would like to see us applying this system. I'm glad we're going to reduce costs and therefore increase investment. I'm aware that it's going to reduce over years, but then again we will have other powers to ensure that we encourage people by other means to make the best use of whatever materials arise for landfill, and therefore I'm very happy to support this bill.
Many thanks. I now call Michael McMahon to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. As is evident in the fact that there has been a 59% decrease in the amount of waste sent to landfills from 2000 to 2010, the UK landfill tax has been very effective in helping the environment and moving us towards a zero-waste Scotland, and I am confident that the Scottish landfill tax will do the same. I therefore welcome and support the overall scheme of the Scottish landfill tax. However, the fact that many aspects of the tax are to be decided in subordinate legislation is a point that has been raised in concern during the scrutiny of the bill, and it is because it has created a lack of clarity and a lack of certainty concerning issues such as the rates of tax and the power to change the materials that are taxed, as has been outlined by other speakers. But this is a framework bill that leaves specifics to subordinate legislation, and the Scottish Parliament must ensure that future action on the Scottish landfill tax is open to debate and to further scrutiny. The Landfill Communities Fund is a specific area where details will be decided in subordinate legislation. Now, I support the continuation of the Landfill Communities Fund, which was created in order to benefit areas blighted by being in close proximity to landfills. And the fund works by providing benefits to the communities that are subjected to landfills out of the taxes raised from those landfills. In Scotland, the idea that communities should have access to environmental justice is one that is spreading and is very welcome. And it's led to the government to take a dual approach when it comes to environmental justice. The first part of that is that deprived communities, which may be vulnerable to the pressure of poor environmental conditions, should not bear a disproportionate burden of negative environmental impacts, and I think that's absolutely right. The second is also correct in that it says that communities should have access to the information and to the means to participate in decisions which affect the quality of their local environment. Now, I represent an area where 4 landfill sites are within close proximity to each other, and my community has been disproportionately burdened by the negative effects of these landfill sites. However, in the past, the Landfill Communities Fund has helped my community in funding local projects to mitigate the effects that result from living near those landfills. In this way, the Landfill Communities Fund has helped move Scotland towards fulfilling the principles of environmental justice. However, there have now been suggestions to review the scope of the Landfill Communities Fund that leave me with some concerns. Organisations such as SEPA and COSLA have suggested that money from Landfill Communities Fund could be used for funding wider environmental objectives that are not specific to any one location, instead of being exclusively used for the communities within a 10-mile radius of a landfill site. Now, I take on board the points that have been made, especially by people like Rob Gibson, that where you've got rural communities, 10 miles may be too restrictive, that there will be communities affected by a landfill site, but they may be beyond that 10-mile radius. But we're talking here about specific projects which may be Scotland-wide and have nothing to do with landfill at the location. So I think we have to be concerned that that would be the case. Because a change in the current scope of the Landfill Communities Fund would be fundamentally unfair and violate the principles of environmental justice that have been sought to be upheld by those who are interested in that subject. But it's widely known that communities that live near landfill sites face much more environmental injustice than those that do not. Those living near landfills have not only to deal with the emissions that pollute the air, water and soil, but also have to burden the costs of the local nuisances that result from living in close proximity to a landfill. These nuisances include odour, dust, litter, noise, vermin and visual intrusion. And landfills not only affect the quality of life in a community, but also present an actual cost to communities, as exemplified in housing prices. In Scotland, homes which fall into close proximity of a landfill are valued at 40% less than similar homes that are not situated near a landfill. So changing the current scope of the fund would also leave communities with less money to mitigate the effects of landfills. The landfill tax is estimated to generate £107 million in the first year of implementation. However, the fund is estimated to fall to £40.5 million in 2025. So opening the fund to broader environmental objectives, coupled with the projection that landfill returns will dissipate, could leave communities most affected by landfill with less funding in the long run. And although the amount of waste dumped in landfills is projected to decrease as a result of the landfill tax, communities in close vicinity to landfills will continue to need funding. So landfill sites, even if they are closed, will continue to negatively affect communities for years to come. This means that local communities will need access to the funds long after landfill sites have closed. And communities that are a dumping ground for the rest of Scotland should receive all the benefits that result from taxation of landfills and should have the only say in how those funds are used. At the end of the day, this money is raised at the expense of those communities near landfills, and therefore the money should be dedicated to those communities. As has been said earlier, this bill, as with other bills that have come forward under the Scotland Act, did suggest that they would be dry and very detailed, but I found them, in the context of the debates around them, to be very interesting, and I look forward to see how the Cabinet Secretary will address the points that have been raised, not just this afternoon, but in our report as we move forward into stage 2. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call Mark MacDonald to be followed by Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think that members have covered how we got to where we are with the landfill tax being devolved to this Parliament, and I think that it is, in my view, another emphasis of the fact that we are able to do things in Scotland in this Parliament in terms of the administering of taxation and the responsibilities that come with that. And I think that there are a number of issues that have been highlighted during the course of the debate, which I want to focus in a little bit on in my contribution. And the first of those is around the block grant adjustment. And I think that, having not been part of the committee evidence sessions, I've listened closely to what has been said in the debate around the notion that this would be based on projections that were being made by the OBR. And I think that what gives me cause for some concern in that regard, leaving aside the fact that if you look at, for example, the OBR projections and forecasts on things like economic growth and oil revenues, they generally tend not to be that which is recognised in reality. Looking simply at its own projections over the last over a 12-month period. In March 2012, they estimated that in 2014-15 the landfill tax income would be £145 million. In 2015-16, £151 million, and in 2016-17, £157 million. By December of that same year, they had reduced that to £105, £107 and £107 million respectively, and by March of this year, just 12 months later, £104, £105 and £105 million respectively. Now, that is quite a significant adjustment for a 12-month period to be making. And if it were to transpire that they had underestimated or indeed overestimated at any particular stage, that obviously has implications for the block grant adjustment and potential clawback in future if it turns out projections do not match up to reality. So it's important to ensure that the sums add up on that. And I'd welcome the Cabinet Secretary's views in this summing up on how he sees the role of the OBR projections and whether there are better ways that this could be looked at for future years. I think that the importance of the bill is not just around its revenue implications, but also the fact that, and has been acknowledged, that this is a taxation that clearly is linked to environmental sustainability, and a tax that is essentially designed as a deterrent to landfill and an encouragement, if you will, to look at alternative means of waste disposal, which will reduce landfill tax burdens on public bodies and organisations going forward. And I don't think we should be afraid to administer it in that respect. And that's why I was interested by the point that Mr Brown was making about the rate at which the tax is to be levied. And I think what I would caution against is entering into any kind of taxation competition on the rate at which landfill tax is being levied. I also don't buy this argument about waste tourism, and I think it was quite appropriately summed up by the point that Rob Gibson was making, which is that even within Scotland, many authorities have significant distances to travel in order to dispose of landfill. The notion that authorities will be, or organisations will be sending trucks across the border in order to dispose of landfill for what will probably be a marginal saving on the tax, but would soon be gobbled up by the associated transportation costs, I think doesn't really bear scrutiny and doesn't stand up to the realities that would be recognised. And I see Mr Brown has that twinkle in his eye that he's clearly got a clever point to make, so I'll allow him to make it.
It's just a direct quote from the Bill team. The committee, this is a direct quote from the Bill team and indeed the Cabinet Secretary. The committee would be surprised at how small the differential in tax rates would be for it to be cost-effective to move waste. That's what the Bill team told the committee.
Mark MacDonald.
What I'm saying to Mr Brown is that I don't think that that argument would stand up to scrutiny based on what Mr Gibson himself has said. If you were looking at simply going from one part of the border to another part of the border, I don't think that that would be an economic way in which to dispose of waste, but we will agree to disagree in that respect. In terms of the Landfill Communities Fund, prior to being elected to this chamber in 2011, I served as the chair of an organisation, Aberdeen Greenspace, who administered landfill community funding through grant aid and delivery of environmental projects. I welcome the fact that in his evidence to the Finance Committee on the 19th of June, the Cabinet Secretary stated that at present, Scotland actually gets less in terms of its share of landfill tax receipts than would be expected. 9.2% is the landfill tax receipts that have gone from Scotland to the UK pot, but only 7% of landfill community fund spending has contributed to projects in Scotland. That gives us an opportunity, I think, through the administering of a landfill communities fund in Scotland to address some of that imbalance. I think that what is interesting as well is to look at, when we do come to the establishment of the Landfill Communities Fund in Scotland, the need to ensure that, although it will be done through subordinate legislation, obviously organisations such as Aberdeen Greenspace, who are in my constituency, would want to perhaps feed in their thoughts on how it might operate and how it might operate differently to that which currently is administered through Entrust. And so I would welcome an opportunity perhaps to have that dialogue outside of the debate. the 10-mile radius, Presiding Officer, I take on board the point that was made by Michael McMahon. I will finish just after this. I take on board the point that was made by Michael McMahon. My experience through working with Aberdeen Green Space was slightly different in that there were often opportunities to expand the work being done through landfill community funding, but the 10-mile radius proved a barrier to that. And I think that we have to accept and recognise that environmental sustainability doesn't always have to be geographically constrained, and I think the broadening out of the ability to use the money for other projects would perhaps have a subsequent knock-on to the landfill that we're seeing in Scotland, so might indirectly benefit those communities who find themselves adjacent to landfill, and some of those communities are just on the border of my constituency as well. So I think that the 10-mile radius does bear needing to be looked at, because I think that there are opportunities there that would be restricted if we were to retain that.
Many thanks. I now call Claudia Beamish to be followed by Jean Urquhart.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to speak in this debate on the proposed landfill tax bill. Not being a member of the Finance Committee, I want to take a step back and say something about zero waste and climate change to help set the context of this bill, building on the Cabinet Secretary's broader remarks and how it fits with other policies. My starting point is, of course, where we want to get to, zero waste. In the interim, landfill sites must be excellently managed for the sake of those communities near them, and it is right that the local affected communities receive some benefit for the disruption and inconvenience caused. The Rural Affairs and Climate Change Committee spent much time taking evidence on new zero waste regulations which are now in force, and the whole range of Scottish society, from public bodies, local authorities, communities, households and individuals, are now expected to make a contribution with clear timescales and guidelines. There are a range of measures which will come in incrementally over the next few years. For instance, a ban on any metal, glass, paper, card and food being collected separately for recycling from going to incineration or landfill from January of this coming year. There's also a range of support through Zero Waste Scotland and others to match the policies, such as the newspaper Resource Efficient Scotland campaign to highlight changes for businesses. Food waste is, in my view, as well as that of my colleague Hansala Malik and others, an area of particular challenge, not just for businesses, but for supermarkets, public bodies, and indeed for us too, in our own families. How we change is also a learning process for politicians and policymakers. Our committee heard from Professor Walter Stahel earlier this month about the circular economy, where responsibility of the manufacturers is no longer cradle to grave, but cradle to cradle. Zero Waste Scotland is, and I quote, actively encouraging and supporting investment in innovative resource management technologies. And also, all this must be seen in the context of the climate change targets, and the altered waste culture can make a significant difference to these. The Institute for European Environmental Policy report, recently commissioned by Scottish environment NGOs, concluded that on climate, the Scottish Government had depended heavily, and I quote, on policies that do not put pressure on voters to change their lifestyles. That weakness made it more likely that it would fail to hit the 2020 targets. The robustness of the new climate change behaviour change framework will be of fundamental importance in this regard in changing our culture. However, though we have come a long way in terms of cultural attitudes since 2002-03, when we had a deplorable recycling record of under 6%, Scotland now being at nearly 42%, there will still be a need for, and indeed a decreasing amount of landfill, and the tax is an appropriate lever. The Cabinet Secretary has reassured the Finance Committee, I understand, that this bill will be in keeping with the Scottish Government's zero waste strategy and carbon emissions. I want now to focus on the administration arrangements for the new landfill community fund when it becomes devolved. I hope the local perspective from my region of South Scotland might make a useful contribution to how the tax is distributed under the new devolved arrangements. As a rural primary teacher and eco-schools coordinator, I was involved in the Leave and Seat Trust Acorn Awards for local schools over several years. This included a local food production research project for primary school children and a 3D mural made out of recycled materials. The impact was practical and positive. The Trust has asked me to highlight a few points on their behalf, which I support. The administrators of this Trust asked that the new fund should still be distributed very much at a local level, and that local people should have even perhaps more say than they've had in the past in its guidelines. They have also asked for the criteria to be reviewed, and I quote, as restrictions make it difficult to apply for funding, for instance, for school projects. They highlight that due to these restrictions, it is frankly sometimes difficult to distribute funds, and ask that any residue, such as they have, of distributable funds at the changeover time should not go back to Scottish Government, but that it should still be possible for relevant local distributors to distribute these. And finally, they say that the administration should not become more challenging, and the Cabinet Secretary has given assurances on this, that it will be simplified. I would also like to stress the value of the Landfill Communities Fund in supporting biodiversity projects across Scotland, though unusually I have somewhat changed my view during the debate in listening to it in relation to the 10-mile radius. Scottish Wildlife Trust has highlighted the wide-ranging projects such as peat bog habitat improvement and Saving Scotland's red squirrels, just to quote two of many. And I do believe that Rob Gibson's point is very important in relation to wider remote rural areas. But however, Malcolm Chisholm is right. This is an environmental justice issue, and Michael McMahon's clear description of communities affected by landfill must be respected. Some members may have followed the BBC4's excellent programme Costing the Earth earlier this month about an interesting development in Belgium where old landfill sites are actually, for want of a better word, being mined for valuable materials dumped in earlier decades. And I raise this asking whether, in view of the fact that there are 5,000 million tonnes worth buried in Europe, spread through 500,000 sites, whether the Cabinet Secretary has considered looking at this issue from a Scottish Government point of view. The Scottish Government's own low-carbon behaviours framework highlights 10 key behaviour areas and states, and I quote, "The most sustainable option is to prevent waste being produced in the first place. This is the most important one in my view. In the meantime, I welcome the principles of the bill." Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call Jean Urquhart to be followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak today about the landfill tax bill, and I welcome its stage 1 completion. I'd also like to thank fellow members of the Finance Committee for their commitment and interest and dedication in scrutinising the general principles of this important bill. And I'd like to thank the Government for its feedback on the bill, which has made the Government's position clear on a number of concerns of the committee. As a result of the land tax bill, Scottish ministers will become the tax authority for the purposes of Scottish landfill tax, and this is a great step forward. I have confidence in the ability of Scottish ministers and staff to take responsibility for the Scottish landfill tax, as well as other important taxes, such as the Scottish rate of income tax. The bill enables ministers to make an order designating another tax authority, and I welcome the move from the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Employment and Sustainable Growth to set up the new body, Revenue Scotland, as Scotland's tax authority for devolved taxation. Revenue Scotland now exists as an administrative function within the Government, and the Government has been consulting on provisions to establish Revenue Scotland on a statutory footing. The Scottish Government has also indicated that it intends for the administration and collection of the Scottish landfill tax to be undertaken by the Scottish Environment Protection Agency on behalf of Revenue Scotland. Landfill tax administration and collection would become a new function for SEPA, which already visits and inspects landfill sites as part of its environmental regulation duties. This would offer significant advantages for the Government. The existing knowledge and considerable expertise already held by SEPA would create opportunities for significant efficiencies and other operational benefits in relation to the administration and collection of the Scottish landfill tax. That being the case, I support the Scottish Government's intention to have SEPA in charge of the administration and collection of the Scottish landfill tax. And although I give full support to the general principles of the bill, there are two areas of concern that I'd like to draw the Chamber's attention to. First, I believe that one further waste exemption could be considered. Part 2A of the Environment Protection Act states that if no person has, after reasonable inquiry, been found who is by virtue of subsection 2 above an appropriate person to bear responsibility for the things which are to be done by way of remediation, the owner or occupier for the time being of the contaminated land in question is an appropriate person. This means, I think, that individual property owners may end up footing the bill for contaminated land remediation through no fault of their own, and there are live examples of individual householders who have been charged vast sums for the remediation of contaminated land. In his statement to the Parliament on the 7th of June last year, the Cabinet Secretary described 4 principles underlying the Government's approach to taxation, which he reiterated today: certainty, convenience, efficiency and proportionate to the ability to pay. And it's the final principle, proportionate to the ability to pay, that I believe is relevant here. My suggestion is that there should be consideration of a measure as part of the landfill tax bill to allow for costs of contaminated land remediation to be waived if an individual property owner is found to be on contaminated land, has in no way caused the contamination, but yet has been unfortunately designated the status of appropriate person due to the lack of one being found who actually did cause the contamination. By putting such a measure in place, the Scottish Government would be ensuring that its own proportionate to the ability to pay principle was adhered to. Second is in relation to the suggestion of the committee that there should be a lower rate of tax on island wastes for materials for which no viable recycling or recovery routes are ever likely to be. Although the Government has made its position clear on this, I do still believe that a review could be carried out looking into this issue. In Shetland, Enviroglass provides a local solution for Shetland's waste glass, recycling all of the glass collected by the local authority through its bottle bank. This has been essential in minimising the financial and environmental costs that shipping glass to the mainland UK for recycling would incur. However, not all of the island communities are fortunate enough to benefit from such a scheme, and a review could help find alternatives for the islands that lack the means to cheaply recycle waste materials. A final aspect of the bill that I'd like to speak about is in relation to the Scottish Government's zero waste agenda, an ambitious programme of changes that aims to create an environment where the most is made of resources by minimising Scotland's demand on primary resources. This is to be achieved by maximising the reuse, recycling and recovery of resources instead of treating them as waste. The Scottish landfill tax will play an important role in maintaining the economic stimulus required to harness these waste management opportunities and direct the Scottish economy toward a prosperous future with secure access to resources. By doing so, Scotland could follow the great example of its Nordic neighbour, Sweden, and make productive use of waste that would otherwise build up at landfill sites. Finally, we must ensure that the environmental organisations continue to be supported by a Landfill Communities Fund. The Scottish Wildlife Trust, for example, received £3.6 million to date, which has helped it to develop and manage essential environmental and community projects. In summation, I believe that the landfill tax bill is a good and valuable piece of legislation. It does what it's supposed to do. It provides legislative provisions for a Scottish landfill tax to replace the UK landfill tax regime. It provides the Scottish Government with real power to take important decisions on a crucial area of taxation and makes use of the experience and expertise of the Scottish Environment Protection Agency. It is conducive to the Scottish Government's zero waste agenda as we look to greener energy alternatives. Therefore, I support the general principles of the landfill tax bill.
Thank you very much. And finally, I call Stuart Stevenson, after which we will move to closing speeches.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I certainly will not be alone as a member in this chamber in being grateful to the landfill tax for paying for some community facilities, in particular within the boundaries of my previous constituency. It built a new hall at Long Haven. The boundaries have changed. A certain Mr Salmon now has that within his constituency. I no longer do. And it's interesting, too, to hear that we're talking about something like 600,000 tonnes of CO2 being emitted. That's a very substantial figure indeed. Now, there's been quite a lot of discussion about whether we might have waste tourism. And I thought about this before coming to the Chamber, and I looked at a paper that was produced in 2012 for the European Environment Agency by the European Topic Centre for Sustainable Consumption and Production. It's a big paper, 96 pages, essentially looks at how landfill tax in all its multifarious forms works in the countries of the European Economic Area. There's quite a wide variation, but the one thing that's quite interesting in that paper is that there is very little suggestion, notwithstanding, as Mr Brown reminded us, what was said to the committee, that small differences could promote big tourism. There's very little in that paper to suggest that. So I think we have to suspend perhaps coming to an early conclusion on that. We do know that in the UK, landfill has gone down to less than half what it was over the 12 years from 1998, and we expect to see that go down. So I think we can be fairly clear that unless there is a draconian... Very briefly, please.
Hanzala Malik.
Thank you. My interventions normally are very brief. I want to take you to the future. You talked a lot about the past, and that was very helpful. In terms of less and less landfills being used, and I want to draw your attention to the fund that is currently used. And I was just going to ask you, where do you think that type of fund would come for those community groups as the reduction in the landfill tax reduces?
Stuart Stevenson.
It's a perfectly fair and good question. I think, for me, arguing from the constitutional position I do, it is unfortunate that you have a position where you're given a tax which is declining, which we want to decline, and you don't have the full range of taxation powers to do something about that within the overall tax system. So I hope that even those who might not travel constitutionally as far as I do might support the idea that this place should be responsible for all the taxes that are applied in this country, whatever the constitutional arrangements in future might be. Therein lies some of the answer. I want to touch on just a few perhaps disconnected things, and I'm going to go again to the European Council Directive 1999/31. And in particular, in looking at what we charge for landfill, one of the things at Article 10 is about the requirement to make sure that landfill sites charge enough to be able to, for a period of 30 years after they take in waste material, to look after that site. We've got some recent experience of difficulties in remediation in coalfields where there's been business failures. And I wonder whether, looking to the longer term, it might not be appropriate for governments to be actually taking in that money from operators so that the money is certainly around, because there appears to be less and less opportunity to get insurance cover. I don't think we should be looking at that now. That's for the future. But the bottom line is, this is above all about recycling. Now, recycling isn't something that was new. During the Second World War, there was a huge amount of recycling, and the world into which I was born immediately after that was quite recycling-focused. Paper, aluminium, jam jars, lots of things were recycled. And indeed, the focus on recycling that there was in the 40s, 50s, and perhaps into the early 60s is something that vanished. I'm delighted we're getting back to it, and I hope that we do more of it. That world also, of course, we looked at our use of resources more effectively. Our eating habits were much better. And one of the interesting things that under rationing in the war, infant mortality, I don't now have time, I'm sorry. Infant mortality declined and life expectancy increased, even after taking account of casualties in the war. I just want to briefly, Presiding Officer, talk about a couple of wee things. And that is, I commend the use of provisional negative instruments so that ministers can act rapidly, immediately, in fact, but nonetheless Parliament can review what's going on. That's good. One thing, however, I do have a genuine question about, that we are going to tax disposals of taxable disposals that are made illegally. But if it's not a taxable disposal, can we tax it? Because, of course, there's things disposed of that are not going to be taxable disposals. A tiny thing on pet cemeteries, which Jim Murphy legislated for in 2005, which the bill currently says the disposal material has to be entirely of the remains of dead domestic pets. I hope that we might slacken that slightly to allow a container for the dead domestic pet to be also recycled. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, last week, a week ago today, Christiana Figueres, who's the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, was moved to tears when she came out to speak to the BBC after a Chatham House event she was attending, saying, on the whole climate change issue, we're condemning future generations before they're even born. This issue is part of an extremely important agenda. And if I agree with anybody in the recent past, it's with Christiana Figueres. Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. We now turn to the winding up speeches. And I remind members, if they've participated in the debate, they should be back in the chamber for the closing speeches. And I call on Gavin Brown, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Let me then begin my concluding remarks on an issue that I think has reared its head many times over the course of the debate, and that is the issue of waste tourism. When Mark MacDonald says he doesn't buy waste tourism, he might be right. When Stuart Stevenson says we should press the pause button because of the results of a 2012 paper, he might be right. When the Scottish Government Bill team says a tiny change or tiny difference makes a huge difference to the level of waste tourism, they might be right. But the important point, Deputy Presiding Officer, is they cannot all be right. And that's, I think, why the committee didn't necessarily take a firm view on it, but concluded. The committee noted the government's scope to make fewer changes because of the implications of waste tourism, and asked whether the government had commissioned any research or conducted any analysis on the likely impact of any changes to the structure and rates of landfill tax in Scotland on waste moving between Scotland and England. And that, I think, remains the important question. What analysis has been conducted, and what is the correct conclusion given the competing claims made over the course of the Chamber today? Happy to give way to Mr.
Stuart Stevenson.
I just want to basically agree with Mr Brown, curiously enough, that there is huge uncertainty here, and probably research is not in and of itself going to help us absolutely resolve that uncertainty. We're going to have to play the ball where it lands.
Gavin Brown.
I think, though, having research and looking at it in a bit of depth, specifically between Scotland and England, at least gives us a degree of comfort and a better guesstimate than the one that we currently have. And the reason it's really important, Deputy Presiding Officer, is this, because our analysis on waste tourism then impacts on how we might approach various aspects of the bill and various aspects of the secondary legislation. For example, the number of rates. Some people gave evidence saying there ought to be 3 rates. There ought to be a 3rd rate specifically for stabilised materials. If waste tourism doesn't really exist, then fine, that might be a perfectly sensible suggestion. But if it does, that could have a detrimental impact. It has an impact on the materials that you apply under each rate. Some suggested that material that is close to inert but doesn't have a route for reuse or recycling ought to have a separate rate for it too. Again, if waste tourism doesn't exist, a perfectly sensible suggestion that we might be able to put into practice fairly swiftly. So that's why it's so important. And I think it's also critical for the Scottish Government, certainly from now on, to interact as much as they can with the UK Environment Agency. That question was asked by the committee, and the response was that thus far there hadn't been any direct discussion with the UK Environment Agency. I would certainly request that the government takes this up as a matter fairly swiftly, so that we can at least get a reasonable guess on what is likely to happen, which then flows into other decisions. Deputy Presiding Officer, I'm conscious that I didn't respond to the Cabinet Secretary's initial challenge, which was he wanted to hear from all parties in relation to the 10-mile radius existing rule for the Landfill Communities Fund. I listened carefully throughout the course of the committee deliberations and indeed again today, and I have to say I do find myself hugely persuaded by the contribution of Michael McMahon, who I think gave a very passionate contribution once again about his particular constituency and about the impact it's had on his constituents. It's difficult, I think, to get around what Mr McMahon has said, although, again, John Mason made a fair point that 10 miles might be a little bit rigid in a rural area and it might be a little bit too wide for an urban area. So maybe there is an opportunity to change it slightly. But I think the principle upon which the committee agreed that those most affected by the landfill tax should be those who gain. And I'd be particularly nervous about widening it too much, particularly when we know that the size of that fund is almost guaranteed to drop year on year, to the extent that if the Scottish Government projections are right, by 2025 it's probably worth something like 26% of what it's currently worth today. So the idea of widening the slope out at the same time as the fund dropping quite dramatically seems to me one which I would find difficult to favour. I want to return, Deputy Presiding Officer, just to the issue of unauthorised disposals. And again, I think, as I said at the start, we welcomed this part of the bill, which I think represents a huge improvement to the system as it is today, and the Government ought to be congratulated for that. But I do request again that the Cabinet Secretary returns to the point of what is the political objective behind that in the bill. If it is to get SEPA to do more and to go to more landfill sites, unauthorised sites, then I think they probably do need to back it up with resources. The Chartered Institute of Waste Management said to the committee, SEPA would require additional resources in order to bring such activities into the tax regime and to apply any criminal sanctions. And there is a benefit simply by having the law there, because the likelihood is we get additional revenue, and it sends out a bit of a message to the unauthorised landfill site fraternity. But perhaps there's more to be gained by making it a policy objective that we're going to put greater effort into this. SEPA are going to proactively tackle even more landfill sites than they currently do today, so that not only does it stop the criminal element to it, but it also brings in more revenue to the Scottish Consolidated Funds, which allows us to fund our public services. Deputy Presiding Officer, I'm content to leave it there. Thank you.
Many thanks. And I now call on Jenny Mara with 8 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The landfill tax is a result of the 2012 Scotland Act and the financial responsibility conferred to this Parliament in one of the biggest transfers of power since the creation of this Parliament itself, as Ian Gray outlined for us earlier. But it's also important from an environmental perspective, as my colleague Claudia Beamish outlined in her speech. And I read with interest the recent Institute of European Environmental Policy report commissioned by WWF Scotland, RSPB Scotland and the Scottish Wildlife Trust, which found the Scottish Government has actually failed to match its ambitions on key environmental policies, lacking the political will, I think, and resources to make them work in practice. And commenting on that report, Stuart Housden, the Chief Executive of RSPB Scotland, noted major difficulties or complete failures in delivery caused by poor decisions, mixed messages, or the lack of or misdirection of resources. Now, the landfill tax will be a key lever in meeting the Government's zero waste strategy, as we've heard from many speakers today, and, of course, the Government's wider environmental ambitions. And from the contributions we have heard today, it is clear that while the legislation as it stands at stage 1 is largely supported across this chamber, there is a need for much greater clarity on the practical details of the tax, how it will operate in the medium to long term, and what policies the Government have to underpin the tax which link it with their environmental targets. Because the bill as it stands is little more than a framework, providing for the landfill tax, how it will be collected and broadly what waste might be taxable. But as the Finance Committee and many of their witnesses have stated, the lack of detail we have on how this policy will work in practice is impairing a fuller analysis of the bill and its impact at this stage. This clarity is needed most notably in what future tax rates will look like. And while the financial memorandum of the bill assumes that tax rates will not be lower than current rates at the point of transfer, we have to wait until 2014 to know for sure. But why is this? Because, as the Finance Committee report says, this has caused concern among businesses, local authorities and even SEPA, who will be in charge of collecting this tax. Now, Ian Gray, in his opening remarks, called for an early indication of where taxes will be set and how the government will use the tax rate to reduce landfill, a more progressive regime to meet the environmental objectives that I referred to earlier. Malcolm Chisholm highlighted, sitting on the Finance Committee, highlighted the criticism that COSLA made of the fact that there wasn't an early indication of where the taxes will be set. Asked the Cabinet Secretary if he will adopt an escalator, and I hope the Cabinet Secretary might come back to that in his closing remarks, and if he also accepts the link, and I think this is critically important, raised by many speakers this afternoon, between an early indication of the tax rate and potential investments to allow businesses to plan certainly.
John Mason.
I thank the member for giving way. I mean, does she not accept that the indications that have been given are strong enough for people to make investment decisions and they don't need to know the exact detail down to the penny?
Jenny Mara.
No, I don't accept that. I think the experts that gave evidence to the committee, and I noted that John Mason deviated from, I think, the consensus across the chamber that an early indication is preferable. But I think the evidence given to the committee and highlighted by committee members this afternoon has indicated that there seems to be a consensus that an early indication of the tax rate would be desirable. I'd like to go on to some other points raised this afternoon, Presiding Officer. Like Gavin Brown, I was very much persuaded and impressed by, I think, the best contribution this afternoon from Michael McMahon, who raised the important issue of environmental justice for the communities close to the landfill sites, and certainly persuaded me of that argument. I think there is an argument, Cabinet Secretary, for more relaxation, but certainly not too far, perhaps within local authority boundaries, a more flexible arrangement, but rooted within the communities, as Michael McMahon described, because he very powerfully made the case for the impact on people living near the landfill sites, the odour, the dust, the litter, the noise and the visual intrusion that he described, and as well the impact on their house prices, 40% less. So he also made the point that communities will need access to the funds long after the landfill sites have been closed, and that goes back to a point raised by Stuart Stevenson about how we will fund that, and that's maybe a debate to have in the future. Yes.
Jean Urquhart. Could I have Jean Urquhart's microphone?
Thank you. I hear your support for the communities nearest a landfill site, but would the member agree with me that as we recycle more and landfill less, that there can be the same dust and noise and disruption created with recycling plants as there is with taking waste to landfill?
Jenny Mara.
Yes, I would absolutely accept that point, and I think the point Michael McMahon was making about environmental justice would be just as pertinent to the communities that Jean Urquhart described as those near the landfill sites. If I could move on, I wanted to pick up something Stuart Stevenson said about welcoming the return to 1950s recycling. I think he's absolutely right. But I would draw his attention to a report just this week in this morning's Scotsman saying that only 9 councils out of our 32 local authorities are currently meeting their recycling targets. And I'm very aware of this in my own city of Dundee, who used to be under a Labour administration administration, highlighted as one of the pioneers of recycling in Scotland. Our recycling rate has fallen drastically under the SNP administration. I think there is a problem generally in local authorities about how we increase recycling from tenement properties, and that's a cross-party problem that we need to address. But I would highlight that I think stagnation or certainly flatlining of recycling in our local authorities, and maybe ask the Cabinet Secretary to address that as well. I think it's been a good debate this afternoon, Presiding Officer. I think we have raised a number of very important points, and Labour will be supporting the general principles of the bill at decision time tonight.
Thank you very much. And I now call on the Cabinet Secretary to wind up the debate. Cabinet Secretary, you have until 4:49.
4:49, Presiding Officer. Well, that'll be a short speech from me if it's 4:49. I'm sure that'll
apologies.
Warmly.
59.
Well, thank you. I've just suddenly had the requirement to cover some more ground in the process. Thank you, Presiding Officer. This has been an interesting debate this afternoon. I welcome the general endorsement there has been around the Parliamentary Chamber for the approach the Government's taken on the landfill tax bill and on many of the key provisions that are within the bill. And I want to address some of the issues that have been raised by members of Parliament in the course of the discussion this afternoon. First of all, let me address the issue of the definition of tax rates and the uncertainty that's been caused. The Government has been very clear that on all of the new tax powers that we are acquiring, we have to consider the approach that we take to all of these provisions within the context of the Government's budget for any given financial year. Why do we say that? Well, for the very simple reason that there will be a block grant adjustment undertaken, there will be resources taken out of our settlement which have to be replaced by revenue generated by the tax, and that must be considered within the overall budget process that the Government undertakes. And it's not a complicated argument, it's a perfectly simple argument about the fact that when these are now tax decisions that the Government has to take that affect our ability to undertake public spending, and if we don't take them in an organised and coherent fashion in relation to the spending provisions of Parliament, then I'm not quite sure how we undertake that process. So, when people talk about uncertainty about tax rates, well, nobody knows what the level of landfill tax is going to be in the United Kingdom in 2015. That will be set by the Chancellor not 6 months before the start of the financial year, as I will set it out, but about 3 weeks before the start of the financial year. So all this gripping uncertainty that's unsettling everybody involved in the waste industry, I think is just slightly overstated in the debate today, because what we have to do and what I must do is make sure that I bring forward a spending package that's supported by the ability to raise the money to support public expenditure, and that's done through a budget process, and that's how we should define the approach and specify the rates that we take. Of course, I'll take it.
Ian Gray.
I think the Cabinet Secretary makes a very fair point that there is no certainty about future tax rates, and those will be set within the processes of setting the budget, and that's how things are. I think that's right. But I think the point here really is that this is a new tax, it's a shift, it's a change from it being controlled by the Treasury to being controlled by the Scottish Government. If the indication that the Cabinet Secretary has given is that in 2015 he will set the rate pretty much the same as the UK rate that he inherits, why doesn't he just say that? And that would be an end to that degree of uncertainty, at least.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Mr Gray takes us off again. This isn't a new tax. We've got the landfill tax just now. The only difference, the one correct thing about what he just said, is that we'll be deciding about it here in Scotland, not being decided by the UK Treasury. But all the other arguments, I don't think are strong arguments, given the fact that what I've said about the fact that we will, of the approach that we'll take to the setting of the level of taxation. Now, the second point I want to raise is on waste tourism, which has been talked about quite a lot in the debate. Mr Brown asked about what research the Government had undertaken in this question. In 2012, we commissioned Zero Waste Scotland, and to produce a report which is called the Scottish Landfill Tax Bill 2012 an Economic Assessment, which can be found on Zero Waste Scotland's website. And that study showed that an increase in the top rate of tax of between £0 and £15 would create little movement. However, increases of above £15 would see significant amounts of waste flowing to England. So I hope that gives some sense of what are the variables that are involved in tax levels that might drive waste tourism. Thirdly, colleagues asked about... I will do.
Gavin Brown.
Grateful for that. I mean, I've obviously read the government's response to the committee report and looked through the report to which you referred. The difficulty with that report is that there were three primary things that were modelled. One was maintaining the exact status quo, one was status quo with the non-self-assessment model, and one was no landfill tax whatsoever. What would happen if you did that? The three primary bits that were modelled seemed to be not to distinguish terribly much between rates, and I wonder if there's something else that can be published on that.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'll explore it again, but I've just said to Parliament that the research commissioned by the government said that the variability was essentially above £15, which I'm not quite sure what more information Parliament would require on that. It's a pretty direct answer to the points that have been raised. Members asked about the issue of OBR estimates, and Mr Chisholm fairly, I think, reflected my observation on the OBR estimates, which I have found inexplicable on landfill tax. The OBR for 2016-17 has revised down its estimates by 33%. Well, frankly, it's a fat lot of use, that particular estimate. So I do confirm to Parliament my intention to establish a facility within Scotland to enable us to assess the predictions on the various taxes for which we will have responsibility, and that I'm obviously looking carefully at what the Finance Committee consider on this question, and I will take decisions in that respect in advance of the setting of these tax rates in 2014. A substantial amount of the debate has been concentrated on the question of the Landfill Communities Fund, and there are really three elements of that discussion. First of all, on the administration and the organisation and supervisory burden. I've been clear to Parliament that I think the existing arrangements are too cumbersome, so whatever we put in place, which will be a Scottish model, will be a great deal more efficient and administratively straightforward. Secondly, there was a call for there to be a wider scrutiny of some of the arrangements that are put in place, and I will certainly reflect on that in how we take forward the administrative arrangements. But the heart of this debate is related to the issue about whether or not the 10-mile radius should be applied, or there should be a broader reach for proposals. Jenny Mara's contribution, I thought, was a bit muddled on this question. She said that she wholeheartedly agreed with Michael McMahon and then argued for flexibility, which I think makes it a little bit difficult to work out just exactly where the contribution is going on that point. But what I would say is that the existing arrangements... I will do, yes.
Michael McMahon.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary. Maybe help to clarify. There is two distinct aspects of that issue. One is the distance, and it's quite clear that in some instances the 10-mile radius can be too restrictive. The other aspect was the individual or identified projects, which would be Scotland-wide, and that would take money from the local communities to areas of Scotland which were not impacted in any way by landfill. So there are two very distinct aspects, and I think Jenny Mara and I agree that the 10-mile radius could be flexible, but we have to be very careful if we start to take money out of local communities to spread it across the rest of Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary.
I think I then have a series of questions for Mr McMahon about why he thinks that projects that take place in other parts of Scotland don't take place in communities. I don't quite understand what subtle distinctions being made here, that when projects... Well, I'm very happy to give way to Mr McMahon again if he can address for me how projects that happen in other parts of the country don't happen in communities.
Michael McMahon.
It's not very subtle at all. They do happen in those communities, but they happen predominantly in those communities. And therefore, the 10-mile radius protects the impact on those local communities. And if you take money out of to put it into projects which are Scotland-wide, that diminishes the amount of money available to those communities most affected.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, with the greatest respect to Mr McMahon, who I know cares passionately about this issue, that didn't sound like a very clear distinction to me. So what I'm going to suggest to Parliament is that I understand there's
Order,
the issues.
Please.
I understand the issues that are involved here, and I'm very keen to try to come to some form of agreement about how we proceed on an agreed basis. So I'll open up some discussions with Mr McMahon where we can perhaps explore these issues more directly and to see how we can take forward these points in the most effective fashion. Because the Government has been consulting extensively with stakeholders. We've got a range of different views about these points, and we'll reflect very carefully on those points. The next point I want to cover is in relation to the question on illegal dumping, where there's been a broad welcome within Parliament for the approach the Government is taking and the extra provision that we are putting in place. I think that's very much welcomed. What I also want to make sure is that we have an effective approach by SEPA to tackle this issue. Mr Brown asked again,
Order,
would
please.
we be allocating more resources to SEPA to undertake this issue? I think SEPA have got a commendable record of having improved and extended their performance without coming to the Government asking for more resources. And I applaud SEPA for the way in which they have organised their priorities and their approach to deliver a very efficient, effective assessment mechanism at local level. And I don't think we should automatically take recourse to deciding that more resources are required to enable organisations to fulfil these functions. And of course, any resources generated by the landfill tax will fall to the Scottish Consolidated Fund, from which we make our decisions about the allocation of resources to different public service priorities. The final point, Presiding Officer, that I want to raise is just to reflect on the constitutional significance of the bill that we're wrestling with today. This is a bill which gives the Parliament wider financial responsibilities. That is very welcome. Ian Gray made a very strong argument about the fact that the Parliament was acquiring more powers as the years went by. I felt Mr Gray was almost on the verge of explaining his support for the Government's position, that he had come to the view that the necessity was for the Parliament to acquire the full range of financial powers. It didn't seem to me to be a particularly compelling argument that he put forward, that because we had acquired more powers since 1999 over transport, the Scottish rate of income tax, the landfill tax, land and building transaction tax, that somehow we should stop acquiring powers. That's what this Government's about. It's about acquiring powers to enable us to tackle the issues that matter to the people of our country. And if Mr Gray is coming round to that view, then we very much welcome him to this strong body of opinion that realises that we have to have the full range of powers to deal with the issues. Because the point that Mr Stevenson made in the debate is absolutely correct. On landfill tax, everybody is now agreed that the receipts from landfill tax will decline over time. And I've furnished Parliament with my view about the extent to which that decline will take place. The challenge for Parliament is how do we effectively exercise and utilise all of our responsibilities to make sure that whilst that happens, we are able to sustain investment in public expenditure. And that, for me, is the simple explanation as to why we need the full range of financial powers and not just the limited financial powers that we're acquiring under this bill, which I look forward to supporting when we come to decision time tonight.
Many thanks. That concludes the debate on Stage 1 of the Landfill Tax Scotland Bill, and it's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of motion number 6167 in the name of John Swinney on the financial resolution for the Landfill Tax Scotland Bill. And I call on John Swinney to move the motion. Cabinet Secretary.
Formally moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The question on that motion will be put at decision time. The next item of business is consideration of motion number 8039 in the name of John Swinney on the financial resolution for the Victims and Witnesses Scotland Bill. And I call on John Swinney to move the motion. Cabinet Secretary.
Formally moved, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. The question on that motion will be put at decision time, to which we now move. There are 3 questions to be put as a result of today's business. And the first question is that motion 8040 in the name of John Swinney on the Landfill Tax Scotland Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion 7167 in the name of John Swinney on the financial resolution for the Landfill Tax Scotland Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is agreed. The motion is therefore agreed to. And the next question is that motion 8039 in the name of John Swinney on the financial resolution for the Victims and Witnesses Scotland Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. The motion is therefore agreed to. And that concludes decision time. And we'll now move on to members' business. And I would be very grateful if members who are leaving the chamber could do so as quietly as possible. I will allow a short pause to allow members to leave the chamber.